What separates a true philosophical genius from someone who just sounds smart on Twitter? Today, we're ranking philosophers across 7 distinct levels, from the pretenders who aren't really doing philosophy at all the way up to the absolute titans who fundamentally reshaped how humanity thinks about existence, knowledge, and reality itself. Now, before the comment section erupts, yes, all rankings are subjective, but this isn't just one person's opinion dressed up as objective truth. We've established clear criteria for each level, considering factors like historical influence, philosophical rigor, systematic thinking, and yes, even readability. Because what's the point of having profound insights about the nature of reality if you write like you're actively trying to torture your readers? This project draws on reading of primary sources and standard scholarship, as well as existing lists presented by Alex O'Connor and Jared Henderson on YouTube, with plenty of internal debate about whether Hegel really deserves to be in the same tier as Kant. Spoiler alert, those internal arguments got philosophical real quick. Here's what makes this ranking different from the typical greatest philosophers lists you see floating around. We're not just measuring influence or name recognition, we're looking at the complete package. Did they develop systematic philosophical positions? Do their arguments hold up to scrutiny? Did they advance human understanding in meaningful ways? And perhaps most importantly, are they actually doing philosophy or just cultural commentary with philosophical pretensions? You'll notice this list focuses predominantly on Western philosophy. This isn't because Eastern philosophical tradition lacks giants. Thinkers like Confucius, Laozi, Al-Ghazali, and many others are absolutely titan-level figures who've shaped billions of minds. Let us know in the comments if you'd like us to create a companion video ranking great Eastern philosophers and perhaps some important Western philosophers we didn't have space to cover. You'll see some controversial choices here. Jordan Peterson makes an appearance, but probably not where his fans would want him. Ayn Rand gets evaluated on her actual philosophical merits rather than her cultural impact. And some philosophers you might expect to see ranked highly. Well, let's just say not everyone lives up to their reputation when you examine their work closely. By the end of this video, you'll not only understand what separates philosophical wheat from chaff, but you might find yourself questioning the very nature of philosophical ranking itself. That's what good philosophy does. It makes you think more deeply about everything, even the process of thinking itself. So grab your favorite beverage, settle in, and let's embark on a journey through 2,500 years of human thought. We're starting at the bottom with the philosophical pretenders and working our way up to the absolute pinnacles of human intellectual achievement. Criteria and methodology. Before we dive into the rankings, let's establish our criteria. What makes a level 7 philosopher different from a level 3? Here's our framework. Level 1, the pretenders. These are figures who are culturally influential and discuss philosophical topics, but aren't really doing rigorous philosophy. They might ask important questions, but they don't engage with philosophical methodology, construct systematic arguments, or grapple with the technical problems that define philosophical inquiry. Level 2, the well-meaning amateurs. These thinkers tackle genuine philosophical problems and sometimes offer valuable insights, but their work lacks the systematic rigor or argumentative strength we'd expect from professional philosophy. They're trying to do philosophy, but they're not quite there yet. Level 3, the solid contributors, competent philosophers who have advanced specific debates or fields within philosophy. They're technically proficient and have made meaningful contributions, but their work doesn't fundamentally reshape how we think about major philosophical problems. Level 4, the major voices. Philosophers who have significantly influenced major debates within philosophy and whose work remains relevant to contemporary discussions. They've developed important insights that have shaped entire subfields of philosophical inquiry. Level 5, the profound innovators. These philosophers fundamentally changed how we think about major philosophical problems. Their insights opened up entirely new ways of approaching questions about knowledge, reality, ethics, or human nature. They're not just participating in existing debates, they're creating new ones. Level 6, the foundational giants. Philosophers who established entire traditions of thought that influenced centuries of subsequent thinking. Their work provides the foundation that later philosophers build upon, critique, or react against. Level 7, the supreme architects, the absolute pinnacle. These are the philosophers who didn't just influence their own time, but fundamentally shaped how humans understand the nature of reality, knowledge, and existence itself. Their insights are so foundational that we're still working through their implications thousands of years later. Now, a few additional and reiteration of important notes about methodology. First, we're focusing primarily on Western philosophy for practical reasons. Covering Eastern philosophical traditions adequately would require another video entirely. Second, we're evaluating philosophers based on their philosophical contributions, not their moral character or political views. Some brilliant philosophers were terrible people, and some admirable people weren't great philosophers. Third, we're considering both historical influence and philosophical merit. A philosopher might be historically important but philosophically weak, or philosophically sophisticated but historically obscure. The highest-ranked philosophers excel in both dimensions. Finally, we're being honest about the limitations of our sources. Much of what we know about ancient philosophers comes through later interpreters, and sometimes we're evaluating reconstructions rather than original arguments. We'll note these limitations where they're relevant. With our criteria established, let's begin our journey through the levels of philosophical achievement. Level 1. The Pretenders. They talk the talk, but don't walk the philosophical walk. Level 1 houses the philosophical posers, figures who discuss big existential questions but bypass rigorous philosophical inquiry. They sound profound but lack systematic argumentation and conceptual precision. Jordan Peterson, the psychology professor who became a cultural guru. Let's address the elephant in the room first. Jordan Peterson. Now, before the comments section explodes, let me be clear. This isn't about politics. This is about philosophy. Peterson is a psychologist who became a cultural commentator. He's brilliant at psychology, genuinely insightful about mythology and meaning, and he's helped a lot of people clean up their lives. That matters. But does it make him a philosopher? Here's the thing. Peterson doesn't engage with philosophical methodology. He doesn't construct systematic arguments. He doesn't grapple with the technical problems that philosophers work on. And when he does venture into philosophical territory, he often misrepresents the thinkers he's discussing. Take his interpretation of postmodernism. Actual postmodern philosophers like Derrida or Foucault, whether you like them or not, are doing serious technical work on language, power structures, and the nature of knowledge. Peterson treats postmodernism as this monolithic boogeyman without engaging with what these thinkers actually argued. Before his internet fame, Peterson was a competent research psychologist producing respectable work on personality psychology. The transformation began with Maps of Meaning, an ambitious attempt to integrate psychology, mythology, and neuroscience into a grand theory of human meaning-making. While containing interesting observations, the work lacks the systematic argumentation that serious philosophical work requires. This confusion between description and explanation runs through much of Peterson's work. Science excels at describing patterns and identifying causal relationships, but questions about meaning, value, and purpose require conceptual analysis that goes beyond empirical description. When Peterson argues that ancient myths encode eternal truths about human psychology, he's making claims that require philosophical argument, not just empirical evidence. 12 Rules for Life illustrates this perfectly. Rules like clean up your room contain practical wisdom, but Peterson presents them as profound insights derived from deep understanding of mythology and human nature. He combines practical advice with grandiose claims about the cosmic significance of personal responsibility, treating these cosmic claims as if they followed naturally from psychological research. His cultural commentary reveals superficial understanding of complex intellectual movements. His discussions of postmodernism and Marxism treat serious thinkers as primarily political activists rather than intellectuals requiring careful engagement. When someone like Alex O'Connor tries to explain the difference between hierarchical and temporal causation in debates about Thomas Aquinas, Peterson's response, reportedly, "What the hell has that got to do with anything interesting?" reveals his impatience with the kind of careful conceptual analysis that philosophy requires. Peterson's case illustrates how academic credentials in one field can be mistaken for philosophical authority more broadly. His confidence that psychology has solved fundamental problems in moral philosophy and cultural interpretation represents the kind of overreach we see in other scientific approaches to philosophical questions. The deeper problem is that Peterson bypasses the careful conceptual analysis that philosophical questions require. Instead of engaging with centuries of philosophical work on meaning and human purpose, he assumes that empirical findings about personality can directly generate answers to fundamental questions about existence. Peterson's cultural influence demonstrates both the hunger for philosophical wisdom in contemporary culture and the confusion that results when that hunger is fed with content that lacks the conceptual precision and argumentative rigor that genuine philosophical inquiry requires. He's doing psychology-informed cultural commentary, which is valuable, but it's not philosophy in any rigorous sense. That said, if we had to place him somewhere, he'd be here in level 1. He's culturally influential. He asks some of the right questions about meaning and purpose, but he's not doing philosophy in any rigorous sense. He's combining pop psychology, cultural criticism, and therapeutic advice in language that sounds more sophisticated than it is. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher emperor, who wasn't really a philosopher. This placement might surprise people because Marcus Aurelius wrote the Meditations, one of the most beloved philosophical works in history. It's practical, relatable, and has genuinely helped millions of people live better lives. So why is he only level 1? Because Marcus Aurelius wasn't trying to be a philosopher, and the Meditations wasn't written as a philosophical treatise. Marcus was the Roman emperor writing personal notes to himself about how to deal with the stresses of ruling an empire. These weren't intended for publication. They're private reflections on how to maintain equanimity while making life and death decisions affecting millions of people. The difference becomes clear when you compare Marcus to actual Stoic philosophers like Epictetus. Epictetus develops arguments, anticipates objections, works through counterexamples, and builds systematic positions. When Epictetus explains why we should focus only on what's up to us, our judgments, desires, and actions, rather than what's not up to us, external events, other people's behavior, natural processes, he provides rigorous philosophical reasoning. Marcus simply applies these conclusions. When he tells himself, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." He's not making a philosophical argument about the metaphysics of mental causation. He's reminding himself of conclusions that Stoic philosophers had already established through careful reasoning. The Meditations reveals the relationship between philosophy and practical wisdom. Philosophy involves systematic investigation of fundamental questions through rigorous argument and analysis. Practical wisdom involves applying insights derived from philosophical investigation to concrete life situations. Marcus was undoubtedly a master of practical wisdom, but he wasn't doing philosophy. He was living philosophically. Consider Marcus's famous reflection. Remember that you will die. This isn't presented as a philosophical argument about mortality or its implications for how we should live. It's a practical reminder designed to put daily frustrations in perspective. The philosophical work of explaining why mortality should affect our priorities had already been done by earlier Stoic thinkers. The arguments in the Meditations don't hold up to philosophical scrutiny because they weren't meant to. They're therapeutic techniques drawn from Stoic teachings Marcus had absorbed, not systematic development of Stoic philosophy. When Marcus writes, "Remember that very little is needed to make a happy life," he's not arguing for this claim. He's using it as a psychological tool. This doesn't diminish Marcus as a person. The Meditations demonstrates admirable virtues: intellectual honesty about human limitations, commitment to duty despite personal preferences, and genuine concern for those under his authority. These are the virtues of a wise ruler who takes philosophical principles seriously in practical life. But taking philosophical principles seriously isn't the same thing as doing philosophy. Philosophy requires different intellectual virtues: systematic curiosity about fundamental questions, willingness to follow arguments even when they lead to uncomfortable conclusions, and commitment to building theoretical frameworks that can withstand critical scrutiny. The Meditations shows us what philosophical wisdom looks like when applied to political leadership and personal adversity. It's probably helped more people live better lives than most technical philosophy books. But helping people live better lives and doing rigorous philosophy are different enterprises, both valuable but requiring different approaches. Marcus deserves credit as a political leader who embodied philosophical ideals and demonstrated that power can be exercised with wisdom and restraint. But he wasn't really doing philosophy. He was applying it, which is admirable but different from the systematic theoretical work that defines philosophical achievement. Ayn Rand, the ideological novelist with philosophical pretensions. Ayn Rand presents a more complex case because she explicitly claimed to be developing a systematic philosophy she called objectivism. If one reads Atlas Shrugged, The Fountainhead, and her non-fiction works, and studies her letters and the newsletters she sent to followers, a critique of Rand can be based on extensive engagement with her actual work. Here's the fundamental problem with Rand as a philosopher. She's intellectually dishonest about her own influences and development. Rand claimed that Aristotle was her only significant philosophical influence, but anyone who reads her work alongside Nietzsche can see the massive debt she owes to Nietzschean themes and concepts. Her biographer Jennifer Burns has documented this extensively. Rand absorbed Nietzsche's celebration of exceptional individuals, his critique of slave morality, his notion of amor fati, and his general approach to ethics and human excellence. But rather than acknowledge this debt and explain how she was building on or modifying Nietzschean insights, she simply denied the influence existed. This matters because intellectual honesty is fundamental to philosophical inquiry. You can build on other thinkers, everyone does. But you can't pretend you're working in a vacuum when you're clearly not. Philosophy advances through dialogue, criticism, and the development of ideas. When you misrepresent your intellectual genealogy, you make it impossible for others to understand and evaluate your contribution. Beyond the honesty problem, Rand's philosophical system falls apart under scrutiny. She attempts to derive political libertarianism from ethical egoism, but as philosopher Michael Huemer has pointed out, this derivation doesn't work. Libertarianism depends on respecting other people's rights, even when it's inconvenient or costly to do so. But if one should always act in one's own self-interest, why would one respect another's property rights when one could benefit from violating them? Rand tries to solve this by arguing that respecting rights is actually in everyone's long-term self-interest, but this empirical claim is highly dubious. Many people throughout history have benefited enormously from violating others' rights, and it's not clear that this is changing. Her literary works, while engaging as fiction, don't constitute philosophical argument. When Howard Rourke gives his speech about individualism in The Fountainhead, or when John Galt delivers his radio address in Atlas Shrugged, these are dramatic monologues, not philosophical arguments. They're meant to inspire and persuade, not to establish truth through reasoning. Rand belongs in level 1 because while she's culturally influential and addresses some important questions about individualism and achievement, she's not doing rigorous philosophy. She's writing ideological fiction with philosophical pretensions. Deepak Chopra, the spiritual entrepreneur who misuses scientific language. Deepak Chopra represents a particular type of non-philosopher who nonetheless gets taken seriously in some circles as a deep thinker about consciousness, reality, and human potential. His books sell millions of copies, and he has a massive following among people seeking spiritual wisdom and alternative approaches to health and well-being. The problem is that Chopra systematically misuses scientific terminology to make his spiritual claims sound more authoritative than they actually are. He throws around terms from quantum physics, quantum consciousness, quantum healing, quantum entanglement of love, without any real understanding of what these concepts mean in their original scientific contexts. When physicists discuss quantum entanglement, they're describing precise mathematical relationships between quantum systems that can be measured and predicted. When Chopra talks about quantum entanglement of love, he's not referring to anything that could be scientifically tested or philosophically analyzed. He's using quantum as a synonym for mysterious or non-material without any regard for what quantum mechanics actually says. This approach exploits the legitimate authority that science has earned through centuries of rigorous empirical investigation. Scientists have discovered genuine facts about the physical world through careful experimentation, mathematical modeling, and peer review. When someone like Chopra appropriates scientific terminology without subjecting his claims to scientific methodology, he's trading on this earned authority while avoiding the intellectual discipline that created it. Real philosophers who work on consciousness, people like David Chalmers, Thomas Nagel, or Daniel Dennett, engage seriously with neuroscience, psychology, and physics when these fields are relevant to their work. They understand the science well enough to know when they're speculating beyond it, and they're careful to distinguish between empirical claims that can be tested and philosophical interpretations that require different kinds of argument. Chopra uses scientific language as mystical poetry that sounds profound but doesn't actually mean anything specific. This undermines serious inquiry into consciousness and spirituality by encouraging people to believe they can understand complex concepts without studying them carefully or subjecting their beliefs to critical examination. There are genuine philosophical questions about the nature of consciousness, the possibility of contemplative insight, and the relationship between subjective experience and objective reality. Religious and spiritual traditions have developed sophisticated methods for investigating these questions. Meditation practices that train attention, contemplative approaches that examine the structure of experience, and philosophical frameworks that integrate subjective insight with rational analysis. Chopra's pseudo-scientific approach bypasses this kind of careful investigation in favor of impressive-sounding claims that can't be evaluated or tested. This does a disservice to both scientific understanding and legitimate spiritual inquiry, creating confusion about what serious investigation into consciousness and spirituality actually requires. The common thread in Level 1. What unites all our Level 1 figures is that while they discuss philosophical topics and sometimes ask important questions, they're not really doing philosophy. They're not constructing systematic arguments, engaging seriously with counterpositions, or contributing to the ongoing development of philosophical understanding. This doesn't necessarily make them worthless. Peterson's psychological insights might be valuable, Rand's novels might inspire people, Marcus's meditations might provide comfort, and Chopra's books might help some people feel more spiritual. But none of this constitutes philosophical achievement. Philosophy requires specific methodological commitments, careful argument construction, engagement with objections, systematic development of positions, and honest acknowledgement of influences and limitations. When public intellectuals skip these requirements while claiming philosophical authority, they're not doing philosophy, they're doing something else entirely. Level 2. The well-meaning amateurs. Level 2 consists of thinkers who genuinely attempt to tackle philosophical problems and sometimes offer valuable insights, but whose work lacks the systematic rigor or argumentative strength we'd expect from mature philosophical inquiry. They're trying to do philosophy, but they're not quite there yet. Blaise Pascal, the mathematical genius who dabbled in philosophy. Pascal made revolutionary contributions to mathematics and physics. He invented probability theory and made fundamental discoveries about atmospheric pressure. But his philosophical work, while famous, reveals the limitations of applying mathematical thinking to existential questions. Pascal's wager is his most famous philosophical contribution. Even if you can't prove God exists, you should believe anyway because the potential payoff, eternal salvation, vastly outweighs the cost, religious practice, while the potential cost of disbelief, eternal damnation, vastly outweighs any earthly benefits of atheism. As decision theory, this has elegance. Pascal was essentially applying early probability reasoning to the question of religious belief. But as philosophical argument, it's deeply problematic. First, there's the many gods objection. Which God should we believe in? The Christian God, Allah, Zeus. What if the true God actually punishes people for believing without evidence or rewards honest doubt over fearful belief? Pascal assumes we're choosing between the Christian God and no God, but the actual choice set is much larger. Second, there's the question of whether belief is really voluntary in the way Pascal assumes. Can you just decide to believe something because it's prudentially rational? Most people find that belief is responsive to evidence, not just to practical considerations. You can't flip a switch and start believing in God because the wager says you should. Third, Pascal doesn't seriously engage with the costs of belief. He assumes religious practice is relatively costless, but this ignores the opportunity costs of time, the psychological costs of forcing yourself to believe something you're not convinced of, and the potential social costs of religious commitment. The deeper problem is that Pascal treats religious belief as if it's analogous to a mathematical wager, but faith involves psychological and existential dimensions that resist this kind of calculation. When someone faces ultimate questions about meaning and mortality, telling them to run a cost-benefit analysis misses something essential about what these questions demand from us. Pascal's more interesting insights concern the human condition itself. The heart has its reasons which reason does not know, captures something important about the limitations of purely rational approaches to life's most important questions. His analysis of humans as caught between our animal nature and our aspiration to something higher remains psychologically acute. His anthropological observations demonstrate genuine psychological insight. Pascal's analysis of human restlessness, our need for distraction from mortality, and the psychological functions of social hierarchy remain relevant for understanding human motivation and social behavior. His famous observation that all of humanity's problems stem from man's inability to sit quietly in a room alone captures something essential about the anxious quality of human consciousness. These insights anticipate later developments in psychology, sociology, and existential philosophy, but they remain at the level of observation rather than systematic theory. Pascal identifies patterns in human behavior and experience, but he doesn't develop theoretical frameworks that could explain why these patterns exist or what their implications might be for how we should live. But Pascal wasn't really trying to convert skeptics with the wager argument. It appears in his Pensées, which were fragments of a larger work defending Christianity that he never completed. He was exploring the relationship between reason and faith, and the wager is just one small part of that larger project. Pascal never develops these insights into systematic philosophical positions. His Pensées remain fragments, brilliant observations and penetrating analyses that don't cohere into unified theoretical frameworks. He identifies important problems but doesn't construct the kind of rigorous arguments that would be required to resolve them. Pascal belongs in level 2 because while his mathematical genius is undeniable and his psychological observations often penetrating, his philosophical work lacks the systematic development that would engage seriously with alternative viewpoints and build toward comprehensive understanding of the questions he raises. Albert Camus, the literary philosopher who rejected philosophy. Camus explicitly rejected being called a philosopher, preferring writer or moralist. But his exploration of absurdity and rebellion has been philosophically influential enough that he's regularly grouped with existentialist philosophers like Sartre and de Beauvoir. Camus's central insight is that human existence is fundamentally absurd. We desperately want meaning, purpose, and rational explanation, but the universe doesn't provide them. We're like Sisyphus, eternally pushing his boulder up the mountain, engaged in a task that's ultimately meaningless. The disconnect between our need for meaning and the universe's silence about ultimate purpose creates the condition Camus calls the absurd. Unlike nihilists who despair at this realization, or existentialists who try to create meaning through authentic choice, Camus argues that we should embrace the absurdity. We should be like Sisyphus who, in Camus' imagination, finds joy in the struggle itself. The struggle itself toward the heights is enough to fill a man's heart. This vision has resonated powerfully with readers who feel caught between the desire for meaning and the apparent meaninglessness of existence. But as philosophical argument, it runs into serious problems. Thomas Nagel's paper, The Absurd, exposes key weaknesses. If life is absurd because our desire for ultimate meaning can't be satisfied by anything the universe provides, why is this problematic unless we already assume ultimate meaning matters? Camus's literary approach to philosophical themes creates both the strengths and limitations of his contribution. His novels succeed in making abstract philosophical questions concrete and emotionally resonant. The Stranger doesn't just discuss the concept of absurdity, it dramatizes what it might feel like to experience life as fundamentally meaningless while still having to make choices and take actions. The character of Meursault embodies the philosophical problem of living authentically in an apparently meaningless universe. His indifference to social conventions, his honesty about his emotional responses, and his refusal to perform the kinds of meaningful narratives that society expects all illustrate what Camus calls absurd living, accepting the disconnect between human need for meaning and the universe's silence. But literary presentation of themes, while powerful, doesn't constitute philosophical argument. Camus shows us what absurd existence might look like, but he doesn't provide systematic reasons for accepting his analysis of the human condition or his recommendations for how to respond to absurdity. Camus's concept of revolt attempts to provide a more positive response to absurdity than either suicide or false hope. The absurd person should rebel against meaninglessness, not by creating false meanings, but by affirming life despite its ultimate pointlessness. This rebellion expresses human dignity through the very refusal to accept either despair or comfortable illusions. This notion of revolt influenced later political and cultural movements, but it raises philosophical questions that Camus never adequately addresses. If the universe is truly absurd, if there are no objective grounds for preferring one response over another, then why is revolt more appropriate than resignation, suicide, or the creation of comforting illusions? Camus seems to assume that human dignity and life affirmation are values worth preserving, but this assumption contradicts his claim that the universe provides no guidance about what we should value. His influence on literature, politics, and cultural criticism has been enormous, and his insights about the human condition continue to resonate with readers caught between traditional religious certainties and modern scientific materialism. But his refusal to develop systematic philosophical positions limits his contribution to philosophical understanding, even as it enhances his power as a cultural critic and literary artist. Sam Harris, the neuroscientist who thinks science can solve ethics. Sam Harris represents one of the most ambitious attempts in contemporary philosophy to ground ethics in empirical facts about conscious experience. His central thesis in The Moral Landscape is that questions of human values can ultimately be answered by science because they concern facts about the well-being of conscious creatures. Harris's argument begins with his famous thought experiment. Imagine the worst possible misery for everyone. A universe where every conscious being suffers as intensely as possible for as long as possible, with no redemptive meaning or silver lining. If this scenario isn't bad, Harris argues, then the word bad has no meaning. What could we possibly mean by bad if not something like this? This isn't circular reasoning, but an attempt to establish what philosophers call semantic bedrock. Harris is making a transcendental argument. If moral terms like good and bad refer to anything coherent, they must connect to what could conceivably matter to conscious beings. Once you grant that the worst possible misery for everyone would be bad, you're committed to the view that well-being matters morally. The problem emerges when we examine what this argument actually establishes. Alex O'Connor's critique during their discussion exposes the central weakness. Harris conflates objective facts about subjective states with objective moral truths. When someone puts their hand on a hot stove, it's objectively true that they experience subjective suffering. But the moral significance of that suffering, whether we ought to care about preventing it, doesn't follow from the empirical fact alone. O'Connor's emotivism poses a particularly sharp challenge. If moral statements are just expressions of preference rather than truth-apt propositions, then Harris's entire project collapses. When O'Connor suggests that saying murder is wrong is equivalent to saying boo murder, Harris struggles to provide a decisive refutation. His response that some preferences are so fundamental they eclipse others doesn't bridge the gap between psychology and genuine normativity. The deeper issue becomes apparent when Harris faces the is-ought distinction. He offers two responses. First, that science itself presupposes values like logical consistency. Second, that he's willing to abandon ought language entirely and speak only descriptively. But this creates an impossible dilemma. If Harris is making genuine moral claims, he needs to bridge facts and values. If he's merely describing preferences, he's not doing ethics at all. Contemporary philosophers have identified additional problems. Michael Humer points out that Harris's utilitarian framework leads to counterintuitive conclusions about punishment and rights. If well-being is all that matters morally, why not torture innocent people if it somehow maximizes overall happiness? Harris's response, that such scenarios are empirically implausible, misses the point. The logical structure of his theory permits these conclusions even if they're practically unlikely. Patricia Churchland argues that Harris oversells neuroscience's capacity to resolve moral questions. Brain imaging can tell us about the neural correlates of moral judgment, but it can't determine which moral judgments are correct. The fact that people's brains activate differently when considering various moral scenarios doesn't establish which scenarios are actually right or wrong. Harris's treatment of cultural differences reveals another weakness. He dismisses practices like the Taliban's restrictions on women by claiming they reduce well-being, but this assumes his conception of well-being is correct. While most people would agree that severe restrictions on women's freedom are harmful, the philosophical challenge remains. Religious fundamentalists would argue that spiritual well-being matters more than the secular freedoms Harris prioritizes. Without independent grounds for privileging his conception of human flourishing over theirs, Harris's position risks reducing to cultural imperialism disguised as science, even when his specific conclusions seem intuitively correct. The most devastating critique comes from Harris's own work on meditation and consciousness. He argues that careful introspection reveals the self to be an illusion. There's no unified subject of experience, just consciousness in which thoughts and sensations appear. But if the self is illusory, whose well-being are we maximizing? The dissolution of individual identity that Harris celebrates undermines the utilitarian framework his moral theory requires. Harris's confidence that science can resolve moral disagreements also faces the problem of moral expertise. Even if neuroscience could determine optimal well-being, why should scientists rather than ethicists, religious leaders, or democratic communities make these determinations? Harris's technocratic vision sidelines the democratic deliberation that many consider essential to legitimate moral authority. The practical implications are troubling. Harris's framework could justify paternalistic interventions by experts who claim to know what's best for people's well-being. If happiness can be scientifically optimized, why not mandate meditation, regulate diet, or control reproduction to maximize collective flourishing? Harris's response that such policies would reduce well-being in practice doesn't address the theoretical permission his framework provides. Harris deserves credit for raising important questions about the relationship between facts and values, and his integration of insights from neuroscience and contemplative traditions demonstrates genuine interdisciplinary sophistication. He's genuinely engaged in rigorous philosophical argument rather than superficial scientism, but his central project, grounding ethics in brain science, fails to deliver what it promises. His attempt to resolve the metaethical problems that have puzzled philosophers for centuries doesn't succeed on its own terms. The moral landscape remains as philosophically contested as ever, with Harris's contribution being valuable provocation rather than definitive resolution. He belongs in level 2 because while he's doing serious philosophy, his foundational project ultimately doesn't resolve the metaethical problems it's meant to solve. John Rawls, the political philosopher who reinvented justice. John Rawls achieved something remarkable in 20th century philosophy. He made political philosophy interesting again. When a theory of justice appeared in 1971, the field had been largely abandoned by serious philosophers, dismissed as mere ideology or reduced to conceptual analysis. Rawls single-handedly revived systematic normative political theory and created the framework within which most contemporary debates about justice still operate. Rawls's central contribution is the original position, a thought experiment designed to determine principles of justice that rational people would choose if they didn't know their place in society. Imagine you're designing the basic structure of society from behind a veil of ignorance, where you don't know whether you'll be rich or poor, talented or disabled, religious or secular, male or female. What principles would you choose to govern this society, knowing you might end up anywhere within it? The elegance of this approach is that it transforms questions about justice into questions about rational choice under uncertainty. You can't stack the deck in favor of your particular interests because you don't know what those interests will be. Rawls argues that people in the original position would choose two principles. First, equal basic liberties for all. Second, social and economic inequalities are justified only if they benefit the worst-off members of society. This second principle, the difference principle, represents Rawls's most controversial innovation. Rather than demanding equality of outcomes, it permits inequality, but only when it improves the position of the least advantaged. A society where some people earn more is just if their higher earnings somehow benefit the poor, perhaps by providing incentives for productive activity that generates jobs and tax revenue. The philosophical sophistication of Rawls's approach becomes apparent when compared to utilitarian alternatives. Utilitarianism might justify severe oppression of minorities if it maximizes overall happiness. But people in the original position wouldn't risk ending up in the oppressed minority, so they'd reject utilitarian principles in favor of protections for individual rights. Contemporary critics have identified several problems with Rawls's framework. Libertarians like Robert Nozick argue that the difference principle violates individual rights by treating people's talents as collective assets to be redistributed. If you're naturally gifted, why should society be able to tax away your earnings to benefit others? Nozick's entitlement theory suggests that any distribution arising from voluntary exchanges and legitimate acquisitions is just, regardless of how it affects the worst off. Communitarians like Michael Sandel challenge Rawls's conception of the person. The original position requires us to abstract away from all our particular commitments and relationships, our religion, culture, family ties, and personal projects. But Sandel argues these attachments are constitutive of who we are, not mere preferences we happen to have. A theory of justice that ignores these deep commitments misunderstands human nature and political life. Feminist philosophers have raised different objections. Susan Moller-Okin points out that Rawls largely ignores the family as a basic institution of society. The original position assumes people are independent contractors, but most care work, raising children, caring for the elderly and disabled, happens within families and is performed disproportionately by women. A theory of justice that treats the family as a private realm beyond political scrutiny perpetuates gender inequality. The most fundamental challenge comes from critics who question whether the original position generates determinate conclusions. Different people might make different choices behind the veil of ignorance depending on their risk tolerance, cultural background, or psychological makeup. Why should we expect convergence on Rawls's two principles rather than a variety of competing conceptions of justice? Rawls's later work attempted to address some of these concerns by shifting from universal moral truth to political consensus. In Political Liberalism, he argues that his principles don't depend on controversial metaphysical claims about human nature or the good life. Instead, they represent an overlapping consensus that people with different comprehensive worldviews can endorse for political purposes. But this move creates new problems. If Rawlsian justice is merely one political conception among others, what grounds do we have for preferring it? And if it's supposed to be neutral between different conceptions of the good, why does it seem to privilege liberal individualistic values over more communal or traditional alternatives? The practical influence of Rawlsian thinking has been enormous. Debates about healthcare, education, taxation, and social policy routinely invoke concepts like the veil of ignorance and the difference principle. Political philosophers across the spectrum position themselves in relation to Rawls, either building on his insights or defining themselves against his approach. Yet Rawls's theory faces persistent difficulties in moving from abstract principles to concrete policy prescriptions. The difference principle sounds plausible in theory, but determining which inequalities actually benefit the worst off requires complex empirical judgments about economics, psychology, and social dynamics that philosophers are poorly equipped to make. Rawls deserves recognition as the late 20th century's most consequential political philosopher. His systematic treatment of justice, his integration of moral philosophy with social science, and his unmistakable influence on academic debate and public policy are real achievements. Yet for all its sophistication, his theory does not settle the fundamental disputes about politics and morality that animate the field in the first place. On balance, he belongs in level 2, a thinker of serious philosophical accomplishment whose framework falls short of establishing the universal principles of justice it aims to discover. Level 3. The solid contributors. Respectable philosophers who advance the conversation. Level 3 consists of competent philosophers who have made meaningful contributions to specific philosophical debates or fields. They demonstrate philosophical rigor, engage seriously with counter-arguments, and have advanced our understanding of particular problems. However, their contributions, while valuable, don't fundamentally reshape how we approach major philosophical questions. Peter Singer, the philosopher who made ethics uncomfortable. Peter Singer has probably done more to make people uncomfortable about their moral lives than any philosopher since Nietzsche. His relentlessly logical approach to ethics leads to conclusions that most people find deeply counterintuitive. We should donate most of our income to help the global poor. Animals deserve equal consideration with humans, and severely disabled infants might justifiably be killed if their lives would involve more suffering than happiness. Singer's philosophical method is deceptively simple. Take basic moral principles that almost everyone accepts, follow them to their logical conclusions, and refuse to stop when the results become inconvenient. This approach has revolutionized practical ethics and created the modern animal rights movement. But it has also generated fierce controversy about whether philosophical consistency should trump moral intuition. The foundation of Singer's ethics is utilitarian consequentialism. Actions are right insofar as they maximize happiness and minimize suffering for all affected beings. This might sound abstract, but Singer applies it with ruthless precision to concrete moral problems. His essay, Famine, Affluence and Morality, presents an argument that most people find impossible to refute, but equally impossible to follow. Singer begins with an uncontroversial premise. If you can prevent something very bad from happening at relatively small cost to yourself, you ought to do it. If you see a child drowning in a shallow pond, you should wade in and save her, even if it ruins your expensive shoes. But if this principle is correct, Singer argues, then affluent people in wealthy countries are morally required to donate most of their income to organizations fighting global poverty. The suffering prevented by saving lives in the developing world vastly outweighs the minor inconvenience of giving up luxuries. The logic seems airtight, but the conclusion is radical. Singer is essentially arguing that spending money on anything beyond basic necessities while people die from preventable causes is morally equivalent to walking past the drowning child. This transforms ordinary consumption into a form of moral failure. Your daily coffee purchase could have provided clean water to someone who desperately needs it. Critics have attacked this argument from multiple angles. Some argue that Singer ignores important moral differences between causing harm and failing to prevent it. Peter Railton suggests that morality must be psychologically sustainable. A theory that demands saint-like sacrifice from everyone will simply be ignored. Others point to the importance of special obligations to family and community that Singer's impartial utilitarianism seems to prohibit. Singer's work on animal ethics has been equally transformative and controversial. His book, Animal Liberation, launched the modern animal rights movement by arguing that the capacity to suffer, not intelligence or rationality, determines moral status. If a pig can experience pain as intensely as a human child, then causing equivalent suffering to either is equally wrong. This principle leads Singer to condemn virtually all factory farming, animal experimentation, and meat consumption. He argues that speciesism, discrimination based on species membership, is as arbitrary and unjustifiable as racism or sexism. The fact that humans are more intelligent than pigs doesn't justify causing pigs to suffer any more than superior intelligence would justify enslaving humans with cognitive disabilities. Contemporary philosophers have raised sophisticated objections to Singer's animal ethics. David de Grazia argues that while animals deserve moral consideration, this doesn't necessarily require treating them identically to humans. Cultural practices, ecological relationships, and species-typical behaviors might justify different treatment even among beings with similar capacities for suffering. Singer's most controversial positions involve bioethics and the value of human life. He argues that severely disabled newborns should sometimes be killed if their lives would involve more suffering than happiness. This preference utilitarian approach considers not just pleasure and pain, but also the frustrated or satisfied preferences of all affected parties, including parents and society. This led to explosive controversies when Singer was appointed to Princeton University. Disability rights activists argued that his views promoted a culture of death that devalued disabled lives. Singer responds that he's not advocating genocide, but rather suggesting that in extreme cases, anencephalic infants who lack higher brain function, for example, ending life might be more compassionate than prolonging suffering. Singer's influence extends far beyond academic philosophy. The effective altruism movement he helped inspire has directed millions of dollars toward the most cost-effective charitable interventions. His arguments have convinced many people to become vegetarian and donate substantial portions of their income to global poverty organizations. Yet Singer's approach faces persistent problems. His utilitarian calculations require comparing incommensurable goods. How do you weigh animal suffering against human preferences or short-term costs against long-term benefits? His theory also seems to permit horrific acts if they maximize overall utility, though Singer argues such scenarios are empirically unrealistic. Singer deserves recognition as one of the most influential moral philosophers of the past century. His rigorous application of philosophical principles to practical problems has transformed how we think about global poverty, animal welfare, and bioethics. His willingness to follow arguments wherever they lead, regardless of social convention, exemplifies philosophical courage. But Singer's utilitarian framework doesn't resolve the fundamental tensions between moral theory and moral experience that motivate ethical philosophy. His arguments are powerful precisely because they reveal inconsistencies in common moral beliefs. But this doesn't establish that his alternative framework captures moral truth rather than highlighting the limitations of any systematic ethical theory. He belongs in level 3 because while reasonable people can disagree with his utilitarian starting point, once that framework is accepted, Singer's specific conclusions about animal rights, global poverty, and bioethics follow with impressive logical consistency. John Stuart Mill, the liberal who defined modern freedom. John Stuart Mill stands as perhaps the most influential political philosopher of the liberal tradition, whose ideas about individual liberty, democracy, and social progress continue to shape contemporary debates about freedom and government power. His systematic defense of individual autonomy established the intellectual foundation for modern liberalism and provided enduring principles for resolving conflicts between individual rights and collective authority. Mill's masterpiece, On Liberty, presents what has become known as the harm principle, the only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over any member of a civilized community against his will is to prevent harm to others. This deceptively simple formulation attempts to draw a clear line between legitimate and illegitimate government interference with individual conduct. The harm principle's elegance lies in its apparent objectivity. Rather than requiring governments to make controversial judgments about what constitutes a good life, it focuses on whether someone's actions harm others. Mill argues that individuals should be free to make their own choices about religion, lifestyle, career, and personal relationships as long as they don't damage other people's interests. This framework generates clear conclusions in many cases. Governments cannot justifiably prohibit consensual adult sexual behavior, unpopular religious beliefs, or unconventional lifestyle choices merely because majorities disapprove. Mill's principle provides strong protection for individual autonomy against what he calls the tyranny of the majority. Mill's defense of free speech has been particularly influential. He argues that even false and offensive opinions should be tolerated because suppressing them prevents society from discovering truth through open debate. Truth emerges from the collision of adverse opinions, not from authoritative pronouncement. Even when we're confident that certain beliefs are false, allowing their expression forces us to articulate and defend our own convictions. The utilitarian foundation of Mill's liberalism distinguishes his approach from rights-based alternatives. Mill doesn't argue that people have natural rights to liberty that governments must respect regardless of consequences. Instead, he contends that maximizing individual freedom typically produces the best outcomes for human happiness and social progress. Mill's The Subjection of Women extends these liberal principles to gender relations with remarkable prescience. Writing in 1869, Mill argued that legal and social restrictions on women's equality violate the same principles that prohibit other forms of unjustified authority. Women's subordination wastes human talent, corrupts family relationships, and retards social progress. Contemporary critics have identified several problems with Mill's framework. The harm principle proves much more difficult to apply than initially appears. What counts as harm? Does emotional distress qualify? What about economic competition that drives others out of business? The principle's apparent clarity dissolves when applied to complex social realities. Conservative critics like Patrick Devlin argue that Mill's distinction between self-regarding and other-regarding actions is ultimately incoherent. Human beings are social creatures whose individual choices inevitably affect community standards and social cohesion. No action is purely self-regarding in a genuinely social sense. Communitarian philosophers like Charles Taylor challenge Mill's underlying conception of human nature. Mill's liberalism assumes that individuals can make autonomous choices about their values independent of social context. But Taylor argues that our identities are fundamentally shaped by cultural traditions and social relationships that we don't choose. The liberal emphasis on individual autonomy may actually undermine the communal bonds that make meaningful choice possible. The most sophisticated contemporary challenge comes from philosophers who question whether Mill's utilitarian justification for liberty actually supports his liberal conclusions. Joseph Raz argues that if maximizing human welfare is really the goal, governments should do much more than merely prevent harm. They should actively promote valuable ways of life and discourage worthless ones. Mill's response appeals to the epistemic argument. Individuals know their own interests better than distant bureaucrats, so allowing personal choice typically produces better outcomes than government coercion. But critics point out that psychological research reveals systematic biases in human decision-making that might justify paternalistic intervention. The practical influence of Mill's ideas has been enormous. Constitutional protections for free speech, religious liberty, and privacy rights all reflect Millian principles. The gradual expansion of legal equality to previously excluded groups follows the logic Mill articulated in his writings on liberty and equality. Yet contemporary liberal societies face challenges that test the adequacy of Mill's framework. How should liberal democracies respond to illiberal religious communities that restrict their members' freedom? Can Mill's harm principle provide guidance about regulating social media platforms or artificial intelligence? The principle's apparent simplicity becomes problematic when applied to genuinely novel moral challenges. Mill deserves recognition as the most systematic and influential defender of individual liberty in the philosophical tradition. His integration of utilitarian ethics with liberal politics provided a coherent framework for thinking about the proper scope of government authority. His arguments for free speech, women's equality, and democratic participation established principles that continue to guide contemporary political practice. Mill represents the high point of Level 3 philosophy. His liberal framework successfully balances theoretical rigor with practical applicability. The harm principle, despite its complexities in application, offers genuine guidance for resolving conflicts between individual freedom and collective authority. His defense of free speech has withstood centuries of challenge, and his utilitarian justification for liberty provides a rational foundation for liberal democracy. While critics raise legitimate concerns about cultural assumptions and practical limitations, Mill's core insights about the value of individual autonomy and the dangers of majority tyranny remain compelling. His work demonstrates how philosophical argument can establish enduring principles for organizing political life. Thomas Aquinas, the medieval giant who married faith and reason. Picture this. It's the 13th century, and the greatest minds of Europe are facing an intellectual crisis that threatens to tear apart everything they believe. Aristotle's complete works have just been translated into Latin, bringing with them a sophisticated pagan philosophy that seems to contradict Christian doctrine at every turn. The Church is in panic mode. Some want to ban Aristotle entirely, others worry that faith and reason are simply incompatible. Enter Thomas Aquinas, a towering Dominican friar who would accomplish something that seemed impossible. He would show that Aristotle's rational philosophy and Christian faith not only could coexist, but actually needed each other. In doing so, he created the most comprehensive and enduring synthesis of reason and revelation in Western thought. Aquinas' genius lay in recognizing that truth cannot contradict truth. If God created both the natural world that reason investigates and the supernatural truths that faith reveals, then properly understood, they must harmonize. This insight led him to construct a philosophical system of breathtaking scope and precision, one that addresses everything from the existence of God to the nature of government to the ethics of commerce. The heart of Aquinas' system is his 5 ways, 5 arguments for God's existence that remain philosophically serious even today. Unlike later arguments that would rely on faith or mystical experience, Aquinas grounds his proofs in careful observation of the natural world. Motion requires a mover, effects require causes, contingent things require something necessary, degrees of perfection require a perfect standard, and the apparent design in nature requires an intelligent designer. These aren't the naive arguments critics sometimes portray them as. Aquinas' first way, for instance, doesn't simply say everything that moves needs a mover. It makes sophisticated distinctions between different types of causation and argues for the logical necessity of an unmoved mover to avoid infinite regress. His arguments engage with genuine philosophical problems about the nature of causation, contingency, and explanation that still occupy philosophers today. What makes Aquinas particularly compelling is how he integrates Aristotelian insights about human nature with Christian ethics. Unlike the Platonic tradition that saw the body as a prison for the soul, Aquinas argues that humans are essentially rational animals, embodied beings whose highest fulfillment comes through the exercise of reason guided by virtue. This anthropology provides a foundation for natural law theory that doesn't require specifically Christian commitments. Aquinas' natural law theory offers a sophisticated alternative to both moral relativism and crude authoritarianism. Moral principles aren't arbitrary divine commands or mere cultural conventions. They're rational principles grounded in human nature that can be discovered through careful reflection. Murder is wrong not because God randomly forbids it, but because deliberately killing innocent people violates the rational principles that promote human flourishing. This framework generates remarkably nuanced conclusions about practical ethics. Aquinas' analysis of just war theory, private property, and political authority influenced centuries of moral and political thought. His principle of double effect, that it can be permissible to cause evil as a side effect of pursuing good, provided the evil isn't intended, remains central to contemporary debates about medical ethics and military conduct. Contemporary philosophers have raised sophisticated objections to Aquinas' system. David Hume's critique of the argument from design anticipated modern evolutionary explanations for apparent purpose in nature. The problem of evil poses serious challenges to belief in an all-good, all-powerful God. Modal logic has revealed potential problems with arguments that move from contingency to necessity. Anthony Kenny argues that Aquinas' 5 ways fail because they rely on medieval assumptions about causation and motion that modern science has abandoned. We now understand that motion doesn't require a constantly operating mover. Newton's first law shows that objects in motion tend to stay in motion unless acted upon by external forces. Yet other philosophers have defended updated versions of Thomistic arguments. Edward Feser contends that critics misunderstand Aquinas' metaphysical framework, confusing efficient causation with the more fundamental metaphysical dependence that Aquinas actually discusses. The 5 ways aren't about temporal sequences of physical events, but about the logical structure of reality itself. The most serious challenge to Aquinas comes from the changed relationship between philosophy and theology since the Enlightenment. Aquinas assumed that reason could demonstrate the existence of God and establish basic moral principles that would then be supplemented by revealed theology. But modern philosophy has generally concluded that reason alone cannot establish such substantive conclusions about ultimate reality. This creates a dilemma for contemporary Thomists. If Aquinas' natural theology fails, then his synthesis collapses into fideism, faith without rational foundation. But if his arguments succeed, then many of his conclusions should be acceptable to non-Christians, which seems not to be the case. The apparent failure of the Thomistic synthesis to convince rational people who don't already share its conclusions suggests either that the arguments are flawed or that human reason is more limited than Aquinas believed. Despite these challenges, Aquinas' influence extends far beyond Catholic philosophy. His integration of Aristotelian virtue ethics with systematic moral theology provided resources that secular philosophers continue to mine. Alistair MacIntyre's influential critique of modern moral philosophy draws heavily on Thomistic insights about the relationship between human nature, virtue, and flourishing. Aquinas represents the pinnacle of medieval scholastic achievement. A systematic integration of the best philosophical insights of his time with religious faith that remained intellectually rigorous and practically relevant. His method of careful argumentation, consideration of objections, and systematic organization became the model for academic philosophy. His synthesis of reason and faith offered an alternative to both naive fideism and arrogant rationalism. Aquinas belongs in level 3 because his philosophical system, while not establishing the theological conclusions it aims for, provides a sophisticated and systematic approach to fundamental questions about reality, knowledge, and ethics. His natural law theory offers genuine insights into the relationship between human nature and moral obligation. His 5 ways, even if unsuccessful as proofs, identify real philosophical problems about causation, contingency, and explanation. His integration of virtue ethics with systematic moral theology provides resources for thinking about practical ethics that remain valuable even for those who reject his theological framework. While the Thomistic synthesis ultimately depends on philosophical premises that many find questionable, it represents a serious and systematic attempt to address the deepest questions of human existence. René Descartes, the man who doubted everything to find certainty. René Descartes woke up one morning and decided to tear down the entire edifice of human knowledge. Not out of nihilistic despair, but from a burning desire to find something, anything, that couldn't possibly be false. What he discovered in that process of methodical destruction would reshape philosophy forever and establish the foundation of modern thought. The year was 1637, and European intellectual life was in chaos. Ancient authorities were being challenged, new scientific discoveries were overturning received wisdom, and skeptical arguments were making people wonder whether we could know anything at all. Descartes saw an opportunity in this crisis. Instead of trying to patch up the crumbling edifice of medieval knowledge, why not start completely fresh? His method was breathtakingly simple and terrifyingly radical. Descartes resolved to doubt everything that could possibly be doubted, no matter how reasonable or obvious it seemed. The evidence of his senses, unreliable. After all, he'd been deceived by dreams and illusions before. Mathematical truths? Maybe an evil demon was systematically deceiving him about even basic arithmetic. The existence of the external world. Perhaps it was all an elaborate hallucination. But then Descartes discovered something extraordinary. There was one thing he couldn't doubt no matter how hard he tried. The fact that he was doubting. Even if an evil demon was deceiving him about everything else, the demon couldn't deceive him about the fact that he was thinking. And if he was thinking, then he must exist. Cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. This insight launched what philosophers call the epistemological turn, the shift from asking what exists to asking how can we know what exists. Descartes had found his unshakable foundation, the thinking self. From this bedrock of certainty, he attempted to rebuild the entire structure of human knowledge using pure reason. The cogito's brilliance lies in its self-verifying nature. Unlike other beliefs that can be questioned, the attempt to doubt one's own existence as a thinking being proves that very existence. It's logically impossible to think, I don't exist, while actually thinking it. This gives Descartes something that survives even the most radical skepticism. But Descartes faced a massive problem. How do you get from the certainty of your own existence to knowledge of anything else? This became known as the problem of the external world, and it still haunts philosophy today. Locked inside his own mind, how could Descartes prove that anything beyond his thoughts actually existed? His solution was to invoke God. Descartes argued that he had an idea of a perfect being, and this idea was so perfect that it could only have been placed in his mind by a perfect being itself, namely God. And since a perfect being wouldn't deceive him, Descartes concluded that his clear and distinct perceptions must be reliable guides to reality. This move strikes most contemporary philosophers as a disaster. Descartes seems to pull God out of a hat to solve the very problem his method created. Why should we trust the idea of a perfect being any more than other ideas that might be products of deception? The attempt to ground knowledge in divine veracity appears to beg the crucial questions about what we can know independently of revelation. The deeper issue is Descartes' sharp separation between mind and body, what philosophers call substance dualism. Descartes concluded that he was essentially a thinking substance that was entirely distinct from his physical body. The mind was non-spatial, indivisible, and immortal. The body was spatial, divisible, and mortal. This created the notorious mind-body problem. How can an immaterial mind interact with a material body? Princess Elizabeth of Bohemia pressed Descartes on exactly this point in their correspondence. If the mind has no physical properties, how can it cause bodily movements? How can stubbing your toe cause mental pain? Descartes never provided a satisfactory answer, and the problem continues to perplex philosophers of mind today. Contemporary neuroscience has made Cartesian dualism seem increasingly implausible. We now know that mental states correlate precisely with brain states, that drugs can alter consciousness, and that brain damage affects personality and cognition. The idea of a soul that could survive bodily death appears to be a relic of pre-scientific thinking. Yet Descartes' contributions to mathematics and science were revolutionary. His coordinate geometry merged algebra and geometry, making calculus possible. His mechanical philosophy helped establish the scientific worldview by treating the physical world as a machine operating according to mathematical laws. His emphasis on methodical doubt established standards of rigor that science still follows. The cogito itself remains philosophically live. Even philosophers who reject Descartes' dualism often accept some version of the insight that self-consciousness provides a special kind of certainty. The phenomenon of consciousness, what it's like to have subjective experiences, continues to resist reduction to purely physical descriptions. But Descartes' broader epistemological project has largely failed. The attempt to ground all knowledge in indubitable foundations has been abandoned by most philosophers. We've learnt to live with fallibilism, the view that our beliefs might be mistaken even when they seem most certain. The quest for absolute certainty appears to be a philosophical dead end. Descartes created modern philosophy by making the thinking subject the starting point of philosophical inquiry. His separation of mind and matter, while problematic, forced philosophers to confront fundamental questions about consciousness, knowledge, and reality that remain central to philosophy today. His methodical approach to doubt established standards of philosophical rigor that continue to influence how philosophers think about justification and certainty. Descartes belongs in level 3 because his philosophical innovations, while not successful in their original form, established the conceptual framework within which much subsequent philosophy operates. The cogito provides genuine insight into the nature of self-consciousness, even if it doesn't ground the universal knowledge Descartes sought. His substance dualism, though false, identifies real problems about the relationship between mind and body that neuroscience and philosophy of mind continue to address. His methodical doubt, while not delivering absolute certainty, established valuable standards for philosophical inquiry. Descartes' failures were productive failures that advanced philosophical understanding even as they revealed the limitations of his approach. Gottlob Frege, the logician who revolutionized how we think about thinking. In 1879, a relatively obscure German mathematician published a slim volume with an intimidating title, Begriffsschrift, Concept Script. The book was largely ignored, dismissed as overly technical and understood by virtually no one. Yet, this work would prove to be one of the most revolutionary texts in the history of human thought, fundamentally transforming our understanding of logic, language, and mathematics. Gottlob Frege had identified a problem that had plagued reasoning for millennia. Natural language was simply too imprecise for rigorous logical analysis. Consider the sentence, "Every man loves a woman." Does this mean each man loves some woman or other, or that there's one particular woman whom every man loves? The ambiguity is built into ordinary language, making precise logical analysis nearly impossible. Frege's solution was breathtakingly ambitious: create an entirely new symbolic language that could express logical relationships with mathematical precision. His concept script wasn't just another notation system. It was the first complete system of modern logic, introducing innovations that remain standard today. Quantifiers, variables, function argument analysis, and the clear separation of syntax from semantics all originated with Frege. But Frege's ambitions extended far beyond improving logical notation. He was attempting nothing less than reducing all of mathematics to pure logic. This project, known as Logicism, promised to place mathematical knowledge on the most secure possible foundation. If numbers could be defined entirely in terms of logical concepts, then mathematical truths would inherit the absolute certainty of logical truths. Frege's analysis of number was particularly ingenious. Rather than treating numbers as mysterious entities, he defined them in terms of concepts and their extensions. The number 2 isn't some abstract object floating in a Platonic realm. It's the concept that applies to all concepts under which exactly 2 objects fall. The philosophical implications were revolutionary. Frege distinguished sharply between the psychological act of thinking and the logical content of thoughts. These thoughts exist independently of anyone thinking them, forming an objective realm of logical content. This led to Frege's influential theory of sense and reference. The expressions "the morning star" and "the evening star" have the same reference, Venus, but different senses because they present that reference in different ways. This distinction explained how identity statements can be informative. Yet Frege's foundational project suffered a catastrophic blow. In 1902, Bertrand Russell discovered a paradox in Frege's logical system. Russell showed that Frege's definition of sets led to contradictions. The set of all sets that don't contain themselves creates a logical paradox. If such a set contains itself, then it doesn't. If it doesn't contain itself, then it does. This wasn't merely a technical problem. It threatened to undermine the entire logicist program. Frege was devastated, writing to Russell that arithmetic totters and his life's work was in ruins. The Russell paradox revealed deeper issues with naive set theory. Contemporary solutions avoid the paradox through more restrictive axioms, but they abandon Frege's dream of reducing mathematics to pure logic. Modern foundations rely on set theoretic axioms that aren't purely logical truths. Frege's philosophy of language faces other challenges. His distinction between sense and reference struggles with fictional names and empty terms. What's the reference of Hamlet or the present King of France? The deeper challenge concerns Frege's Platonism about abstract objects. If numbers and thoughts exist independently of human minds, how do we gain knowledge of this realm? Despite these challenges, Frege's contributions remain foundational. Modern logic, computer science, and artificial intelligence all build on innovations Frege introduced. His semantic theories continue to influence philosophy of language, and his approach established methodological standards that persist today. Contemporary philosophers recognize Frege as the founder of analytic philosophy and modern philosophy of language. His rigorous approach to logical analysis and his distinction between sense and reference established the methodological framework that dominated Anglo-American philosophy for over a century. Frege belongs in level 3 because his innovations in logic and philosophy of language, while not achieving their ultimate foundational goals, established frameworks that continue to generate philosophical progress. His formal logical systems provide powerful tools for analyzing reasoning and mathematical proof. His semantic distinctions illuminate genuine features of language and thought that any adequate theory must address. The failure of the Logicist program doesn't diminish Frege's achievement. His work identified fundamental problems about logical truth, mathematical knowledge, and linguistic meaning that philosophers continue to address with tools he developed. Frege's systematic approach provides a framework for making progress on deep philosophical problems, even when his specific solutions prove inadequate. Bertrand Russell, the aristocrat who demolished certainty. Bertrand Russell was the kind of philosopher who could shatter your most basic beliefs before breakfast and then calmly explain why this was actually good news. Born into British aristocracy in 1872, Russell spent over 7 decades systematically demolishing intellectual certainties that had stood for centuries, leaving behind a landscape of rigorous skepticism and logical precision that still defines much of contemporary philosophy. Russell's early work focused on the foundations of mathematics, where he made discoveries that were as disturbing as they were brilliant. Working alongside Alfred North Whitehead, Russell attempted to show that all mathematical truths could be derived from pure logic, a project that required extraordinary technical sophistication and philosophical audacity. But Russell's most famous contribution was also his most destructive. The Russell paradox, discovered in 1901, revealed a fundamental contradiction at the heart of set theory. Consider the set of all sets that do not contain themselves as members. Does this set contain itself? If it does, then by definition it shouldn't. If it doesn't, then by definition it should. This wasn't just a clever puzzle. It threatened to undermine the logical foundations of mathematics itself. Russell's philosophical method combined technical precision with sweeping ambition. His theory of descriptions became one of the most influential innovations in analytic philosophy. How can we meaningfully discuss "the present king of France is bald" when France has no king? Russell argued that such phrases aren't really referring expressions at all. They're complex, quantified statements that can be analyzed logically. The sentence, "the present king of France is bald," becomes something like, "There exists exactly one person who is presently king of France, and that person is bald." Since there is no present king of France, the statement is simply false rather than meaningless or paradoxical. This analysis dissolved what seemed like puzzling philosophical problems about reference and meaning. This approach revealed Russell's deeper conviction that ordinary language systematically misleads us about the logical structure of reality. Russell's project was to develop analytical tools that could cut through linguistic confusion to reveal the underlying logical relationships. Russell's epistemology was equally revolutionary and disturbing. He argued that our knowledge of the external world is far more limited than common sense suggests. We don't directly perceive objects. We perceive sense data that we interpret as evidence for external objects. Russell distinguished between knowledge by acquaintance and knowledge by description, leaving very little that we can claim to know with certainty. Contemporary critics have identified serious problems with Russell's philosophical program. His sense data theory faces the challenge of explaining how private mental episodes can provide knowledge of public physical objects. If we're trapped behind a veil of perception, how can we ever verify that our sense data correspond to external reality? Russell's logicism, the attempt to reduce mathematics to logic, ultimately failed. Kurt Gödel's incompleteness theorems showed that arithmetic cannot be completely captured by any consistent logical system. The axioms needed to avoid Russell's paradox, like the axiom of choice or the axiom of infinity, don't seem to be purely logical truths. They appear to make substantive assumptions about the nature of mathematical reality. His theory of descriptions faces counterexamples from Keith Donnellan's work on referential versus attributive uses. And Saul Kripke's analysis of rigid designation challenged Russell's assumptions about how definite descriptions relate to their reference. The deeper problem with Russell's approach is its tendency towards skeptical conclusions that seem to undermine the very intellectual project he was pursuing. If we can't know whether the external world exists, why should we trust the logical principles Russell uses to reach this conclusion? Yet Russell's influence on contemporary philosophy remains enormous. His techniques of logical analysis became standard tools for philosophical investigation. His attention to the logical form of sentences influenced generations of philosophers working on language and meaning. His work in mathematical logic laid crucial groundwork for developments in computer science and artificial intelligence. The Russell paradox proved enormously productive, forcing mathematicians to develop more sophisticated theories of sets and classes. While Russell's own solutions weren't ultimately successful, his discovery advanced our understanding of logic's foundations. Russell belongs in level 3 because his philosophical innovations, while not achieving their foundational goals, established analytical frameworks that continue to generate philosophical progress. His logical and epistemological insights provide powerful tools for analysis, even when his specific theories prove inadequate. His approach, combining technical precision with broad theoretical ambition, demonstrates how philosophical rigor can advance understanding even when particular projects fail. Russell's career illustrates both the power and limitations of analytical philosophy. His technical innovations solved some problems while creating others. His skeptical arguments revealed genuine difficulties, while sometimes leading to implausible conclusions. Like other level 3 philosophers, Russell's systematic approach provides valuable frameworks for philosophical investigation, even when his specific solutions require revision. Level 4, the major voices. Philosophers who significantly shaped their fields. Level 4 consists of philosophers who have profoundly influenced major debates within philosophy and whose work remains central to contemporary discussions. They've developed important insights that have shaped entire subfields of philosophical inquiry and continue to influence how we think about fundamental questions. Søren Kierkegaard, the melancholy Dane who invented existence. Søren Kierkegaard walked through the streets of Copenhagen in the 1840s like a man carrying an invisible weight that would crush anyone else. Frail, melancholy, and tormented by his own thoughts, this Danish philosopher would produce insights so penetrating and revolutionary that they would fundamentally alter how humanity understands itself. Kierkegaard didn't just write philosophy, he excavated the deepest layers of human existence and showed us truths we'd been desperately avoiding. The son of a wealthy wool merchant haunted by guilt and religious anxiety, Kierkegaard inherited both financial security and psychological torment. His father believed he had cursed his family through some unnamed sin, and this atmosphere of dread permeated young Søren's consciousness. Rather than being crushed by this inheritance of anxiety, Kierkegaard transformed it into philosophical gold, becoming the first thinker to make anxiety, despair, and existential dread central to understanding what it means to be human. Kierkegaard's fundamental insight was that human existence is irreducibly subjective and cannot be captured by objective philosophical systems. While Hegel was constructing his grand dialectical system that claimed to explain all of reality, Kierkegaard was insisting that the most important truths, how to live, what to believe, how to love, could never be systematized. Truth is subjectivity, he declared, meaning that the deepest truths are not propositions we can prove, but ways of existing we must choose. This led Kierkegaard to identify 3 fundamental modes of human existence: the aesthetic, the ethical, and the religious. The aesthetic individual lives for immediate pleasure and experience, constantly seeking novelty to stave off boredom. The ethical person commits to universal moral principles and social duties. But only the religious stage, characterized by passionate commitment to the absolute despite uncertainty, allows for authentic selfhood. Kierkegaard's analysis of despair in The Sickness Unto Death remains one of the most penetrating examinations of human psychology ever written. Despair is not just a mood, but the fundamental structure of selfhood gone wrong. The self is a relation that relates itself to itself. We are beings who are aware of being aware, who must choose who to become. Despair occurs when this relation fails, when we refuse to accept ourselves as we are, or when we refuse to become who we could be. Most people live in despair without knowing it. They lose themselves in social roles, conformity, and the pursuit of worldly success, never confronting the fundamental question of who they actually are. This sickness unto death is worse than physical death because it involves the spiritual death of authentic selfhood while continuing to exist. The cure for despair requires what Kierkegaard called a leap of faith, not a rational demonstration, but a passionate commitment made in the face of uncertainty. His analysis of Abraham's willingness to sacrifice Isaac illustrates this point. Abraham's action violated both aesthetic sensibility and ethical duty, yet Kierkegaard argued it represented the highest form of faith, the teleological suspension of the ethical that defines authentic religious existence. This emphasis on individual choice and subjective commitment made Kierkegaard the father of existentialism. Thinkers like Jean-Paul Sartre, Albert Camus, and Martin Heidegger all built on Kierkegaard's insight that existence precedes essence, that we must choose who to become rather than discovering who we already are. Kierkegaard's literary technique was as revolutionary as his philosophical content. Writing under multiple pseudonyms, he created a polyphonic exploration of different existential possibilities. This wasn't mere stylistic play, but a philosophical method that recognized the impossibility of presenting subjective truth from an objective standpoint. Contemporary critics have raised serious objections to Kierkegaard's framework. His sharp separation between subjective and objective truth has been challenged by philosophers who argue that even our most personal beliefs must answer to intersubjective standards of evidence and argument. His religious existentialism seems to many to license irrationalism and fanaticism. The deeper challenge comes from critics who question whether Kierkegaard's radical individualism can provide adequate resources for ethics and politics. If truth is purely subjective and authentic existence requires breaking with social convention, how can we maintain any shared standards of right and wrong? Kierkegaard's emphasis on the single individual before God seems to dissolve the possibility of genuine community and social responsibility. Yet Kierkegaard's insights about anxiety, authenticity, and the structure of selfhood have proven remarkably prescient. Modern psychology's understanding of anxiety disorders, identity formation, and the relationship between self-awareness and mental health all bear traces of Kierkegaardian analysis. His exploration of the anxiety of freedom anticipated contemporary discussions about choice overload and the psychological burden of radical autonomy. His psychological insights remain relevant to contemporary debates about mental health and human flourishing. Kierkegaard's understanding that anxiety can be both destructive and revelatory, that it discloses our freedom while threatening to overwhelm us, offers resources for thinking about anxiety that go beyond merely medical approaches. Kierkegaard belongs in level 4 because his insights about subjectivity, authenticity, and existential commitment fundamentally transformed how philosophy approaches questions about human existence. He identified the existential dimension of human experience that previous philosophy had largely ignored. His analysis of despair, anxiety, and faith provided conceptual tools that remain indispensable for understanding the human condition. While his religious conclusions may not convince secular readers, his analysis of the structure of selfhood and the nature of authentic existence transcends confessional boundaries. Kierkegaard showed that philosophy must grapple with lived experience in all its subjectivity and uncertainty. He created frameworks for understanding human existence that continue to generate insights more than a century after his death. His transformation of philosophy from an objective science to an existential art makes him one of the most revolutionary thinkers in human history. Friedrich Nietzsche, the madman who declared God dead. Friedrich Nietzsche wrote with a hammer, and what he was hammering was everything Western civilization held sacred. By the time this brilliant, tortured German philosopher finished his work in the 1880s, he had shattered Christian morality, demolished traditional philosophy, and proclaimed the death of God with such force that the reverberations are still shaking our world today. Nietzsche didn't just critique existing values, he diagnosed an entire culture in terminal decline and demanded that humanity create new values from the ground up. Born in 1844 into a family of Lutheran pastors, Nietzsche was destined for the church until philosophy seized him like a fever. He became the youngest person ever appointed to a professorship at the University of Basel, but his health was always fragile, his temperament always volcanic. Plagued by migraines, stomach ailments, and eventual madness, Nietzsche wrote his most revolutionary works in a race against time and his own deteriorating mind. Nietzsche's central insight was that traditional morality was not timeless truth, but historical construction. and a poisonous one at that. On the genealogy of morality, he traced what he saw as the catastrophic transformation of human values from aristocratic master morality to the slave morality of Christianity. Master morality celebrated strength, nobility, and excellence. Slave morality, born from the resentment of the weak against the strong, inverted these values, making virtues out of suffering, humility, and self-denial. This wasn't just historical analysis, it was cultural diagnosis. Nietzsche saw 19th century Europe as spiritually exhausted, propped up by values that no longer commanded genuine belief. God is dead, he proclaimed, and we have killed him. This wasn't atheistic gloating, but a recognition of crisis. If the transcendent foundation of Western morality had collapsed, what would replace it? Nihilism, the belief that nothing matters, loomed as the terrifying possibility. Nietzsche's solution was radical. Humanity must become its own creator of values. The Übermensch, Overman or Superman, represents not a biological evolution, but a spiritual transformation. Individuals who can create meaning and values for themselves without relying on external authorities. His doctrine of eternal recurrence pushed this self-creation to its ultimate test. Imagine you had to live your exact life again, infinite times, with every detail repeated exactly. Could you affirm such an existence? Nietzsche's critique of truth itself was equally revolutionary. Philosophy's quest for absolute truth was, he argued, driven by a will to truth that was itself merely one expression of the more fundamental will to power, the basic drive of all life to expand, dominate, and impose its perspective on reality. There are no facts, only interpretations, and all interpretations serve someone's will to power. Contemporary philosophers have struggled with Nietzsche's legacy. His critique of objective truth influenced postmodern thinkers like Michel Foucault and Jacques Derrida, but critics argue that Nietzsche's perspectivism is self-defeating. If all beliefs are merely expressions of will to power, what about Nietzsche's own philosophy? The political implications have proven particularly controversial. While Nietzsche himself despised German nationalism and anti-Semitism, Nazi ideologists appropriated his language of the Übermensch. This association, though historically unfair to Nietzsche, reveals genuine tensions in his philosophy about the relationship between excellence and equality. The deeper challenge comes from critics who question whether Nietzsche's project of value creation is psychologically or socially sustainable. If traditional moral authorities have lost their grip, can individuals really create meaningful values from nothing? Don't even the most creative individuals depend on cultural resources and social recognition that Nietzsche's radical individualism seems to dissolve? Yet Nietzsche's influence on virtually every subsequent intellectual movement has been enormous. Existentialists like Sartre and Camus built on his insight that humans must create meaning in a meaningless universe. Post-structuralists adopted his critique of stable truth and identity. His psychological insights about ressentiment, self-deception, and the relationship between suffering and meaning anticipated later developments in psychology and therapy. His critique of nihilism proved prophetic. The 20th century's ideological catastrophes, the contemporary crisis of meaning in secular societies, and current debates about moral relativism all bear traces of problems Nietzsche diagnosed. His literary achievement, combining rigorous analysis with poetic power in works like Thus Spoke Zarathustra, influenced writers from Oscar Wilde to contemporary cultural critics. Nietzsche belongs in level 4 because his critique of traditional values and his diagnosis of nihilism fundamentally altered how we think about morality, truth, and human nature. He identified the crisis of meaning that would define modernity and provided conceptual tools for understanding how values function psychologically and socially. While his positive program remains controversial, his critical insights about the historical construction of morality and the psychological dynamics of value formation continue to generate important philosophical work. Nietzsche transformed philosophy by making it a tool for cultural criticism and personal transformation rather than merely abstract analysis. David Hume, the skeptic who woke Kant from his dogmatic slumber. David Hume possessed the most devastating philosophical mind of the 18th century, and he wielded it with the calm precision of a surgeon removing tumours from the body of human knowledge. By the time this genial Scottish philosopher finished his work, He had undermined our confidence in causation, induction, personal identity, and moral reasoning with arguments so elegant and ruthless that they still keep philosophers awake at night. Hume didn't set out to destroy human knowledge. He simply followed reason wherever it led, and it led to some very uncomfortable places. Born in Edinburgh in 1711, Hume was supposed to become a lawyer like his family expected, but he found law nauseous and philosophy irresistible. His masterwork, A Treatise of Human Nature, was completed before he turned 30, though it initially fell dead-born from the press. History would vindicate Hume's genius, but not before his skeptical conclusions had shaken the foundations of Enlightenment confidence in human reason. Hume's philosophical method was deceptively simple. Trace all our ideas back to their origins in sense experience and see what survives this empirical acid bath. What he discovered was that many of our most basic beliefs, the ones we take for granted in everyday life and scientific reasoning, have no rational foundation whatsoever. Consider causation. We see one billiard ball strike another, and the second ball moves. We say the first ball caused the second to move. But what, Hume asked, do we actually observe? Only sequence. First one event, then another. The idea of a necessary connection between cause and effect is nowhere to be found in our experience. We observe constant conjunction, not causal necessity. This insight demolished the rational foundations of scientific reasoning. Science depends on the assumption that the future will resemble the past, that the laws we discover through observation will continue to hold. But this assumption, Hume showed, cannot be justified either deductively or inductively. Any inductive argument for the reliability of induction would be circular. It would assume the very principle it's trying to prove. Hume's analysis of personal identity was equally devastating. We feel like continuous selves persisting through time, but what evidence do we have for this belief? Introspection reveals only a bundle or collection of different perceptions which succeed each other with an inconceivable rapidity and are in a perpetual flux and movement. There's no impression of a substantial self, just a stream of disconnected mental states. In moral philosophy, Hume delivered what may be his most famous blow, the is-ought problem. Moral philosophers routinely move from factual claims about how the world is to normative claims about how it ought to be. But Hume pointed out that this transition is never justified. You can't derive an ought from an is without smuggling in additional assumptions that themselves need justification. Instead of grounding morality in reason, Hume located it in human sentiment and emotion. Moral judgments express our feelings of approval or disapproval rather than rational discoveries about objective moral facts. When we call something wrong, we're not describing a property it possesses but expressing our negative emotional response to it. Hume's skeptical conclusions could have led to paralysis, but his temperament saved him. He recognized that philosophical doubt, however rationally compelling, could not survive contact with ordinary life. Nature is always too strong for principle, he observed. We can't help believing in causation, induction, and personal identity, even if we can't rationally justify these beliefs. This naturalistic turn was revolutionary. Rather than trying to provide rational foundations for our beliefs, Hume studied how human psychology actually works. We believe in causation, not because reason compels us to, but because our minds are built to form habits and expectations based on repeated experience. Custom, not logic, governs human belief. Contemporary philosophers have engaged seriously with Hume's challenges without fully resolving them. Kant acknowledged that Hume's critique of causation woke him from his dogmatic slumber and motivated the entire critical philosophy. Kant's solution, that causation is a necessary structure of human understanding rather than a feature of reality itself, avoided Hume's skeptical conclusions but at the cost of limiting knowledge to appearances. Modern attempts to naturalize epistemology embrace Hume's insight that we should study how humans actually form beliefs rather than seeking impossible rational foundations. Hume's moral philosophy influenced both utilitarian and anti-realist traditions, while his approach to religious belief provided frameworks for evaluating extraordinary claims that continue to influence contemporary debates. Hume's influence extends beyond technical philosophy. His emphasis on habit, custom, and sentiment anticipated later developments in psychology and behavioral economics. His recognition that human reasoning is less rational and more emotional than the Enlightenment assumed prefigured contemporary research on cognitive biases and motivated reasoning. Hume belongs in level 4 because his skeptical arguments fundamentally altered the trajectory of philosophical inquiry. He identified deep problems about the foundations of human knowledge that philosophers still struggle to resolve. His naturalistic approach to epistemology and ethics created new ways of thinking about belief, knowledge, and morality that continue to generate important philosophical work. While Hume's specific conclusions remain debated, his method of tracing beliefs back to their experiential origins and his recognition of reason's limitations established permanent features of philosophical investigation. He showed that philosophy must grapple with human psychology and that rational argument has narrower scope than previous philosophers assumed. His transformation of philosophy from a quest for absolute certainty into an investigation of human nature makes him one of the most revolutionary thinkers in the tradition. Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, the philosopher who thought reality was logic. Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel possessed perhaps the most audacious philosophical mind in human history. This seemingly mild-mannered German professor, who lived most of his life in academic obscurity, constructed a philosophical system so vast and ambitious that it claimed to explain everything, the entire sweep of human history, the structure of reality itself, and the very process by which truth emerges through conflict and contradiction. Hegel didn't just do philosophy. He believed philosophy could grasp the absolute truth that underlies all existence. Born in Stuttgart in 1770, Hegel came of age during the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars, world historical events that convinced him that reality itself was fundamentally historical and dialectical. Unlike previous philosophers who sought eternal truths beyond the flux of time, Hegel argued that truth emerges through historical development. Reality isn't static being, but dynamic becoming, and this becoming follows a logical pattern he called the dialectic. The dialectical method became Hegel's signature contribution to philosophy. Every concept, when examined carefully, reveals internal contradictions that drive it toward its opposite. Thesis meets antithesis, generating synthesis, which then becomes a new thesis, provoking its own antithesis, and so on. This isn't just a method for thinking about reality. For Hegel, this is how reality actually develops. Logic and existence are ultimately identical. Consider Hegel's analysis of being and nothing. Pure being, when we try to think it completely abstractly, turns out to be indistinguishable from pure nothing. Both are completely empty of determinate content. But this very movement between being and nothing generates the concept of becoming, which unifies and transcends both. This logical development isn't just happening in our minds, it's the actual structure of reality unfolding itself. The famous master-slave dialectic illustrates Hegel's method. Two self-consciousnesses meet and struggle for recognition. One becomes master, the other slave. But this relationship is inherently unstable. The master depends on the slave for recognition, while the slave, through labor and fear of death, develops authentic self-consciousness. The apparent victor becomes dependent, while the apparent victim achieves genuine freedom through work and discipline. Hegel's political philosophy was equally systematic and controversial. The state isn't just a necessary evil or social contract, but the highest expression of human freedom. The march of God in the world. History itself is the progressive realization of freedom, moving from Oriental despotism, where one is free, through Greek and Roman civilization, where some are free, to the modern Germanic world, where all are potentially free. This historical optimism led Hegel to some troubling conclusions. He seemed to justify existing political arrangements as necessary stages in freedom's development. War, suffering, and oppression weren't unfortunate accidents but necessary moments in the dialectical process. The cunning of reason uses human passions and conflicts to advance its own purposes, regardless of individual suffering. Contemporary philosophers have struggled with Hegel's legacy. Karl Marx famously claimed to have found Hegel standing on his head and set him right side up by grounding the dialectic in material rather than spiritual development. Analytic philosophers largely rejected Hegel's system as obscure metaphysical speculation. while continental philosophers continued to engage seriously with his insights. Recent Hegel scholarship has revealed the sophistication of his logical and political analyses. Philosophers like Robert Brandom argue that Hegel anticipated pragmatist insights about how concepts get their content through social practices. Terry Pinkard's work shows how Hegel's political philosophy supports democratic rather than authoritarian institutions. The deepest challenge to Hegel's system comes from critics who question whether reality really follows logical patterns. Why should we believe that contradictions in our concepts correspond to contradictions in reality itself? Hegel's identification of logic with metaphysics seems to rest on an unjustified leap from epistemology to ontology. Hegel's historical determinism also faces serious objections. His confidence that history follows a rational pattern toward increasing freedom seems to ignore the genuine contingency and tragedy that characterize human experience. The 20th century's catastrophes make Hegelian optimism about historical progress appear naive or worse. Yet Hegel's influence on subsequent thought has been enormous. His historicization of reason influenced virtually every major intellectual movement since his death. The idea that truth emerges through conflict, that concepts develop through contradiction, and that understanding requires grasping systematic relationships rather than isolated facts all bear Hegelian stamps. His analysis of recognition remains central to contemporary debates about identity, multiculturalism, and social justice. The struggle for recognition that Hegel identified as fundamental to human consciousness continues to illuminate conflicts over dignity, respect, and social status. The dialectical method, even detached from Hegel's metaphysical commitments, provides a powerful tool for understanding how oppositions can be productive rather than merely destructive. Contemporary philosophers use dialectical approaches to analyze everything from legal reasoning to scientific progress to social change. Hegel belongs in level 4 because his systematic philosophy fundamentally transformed how we think about history, reason, and the relationship between thought and reality. He established frameworks for understanding development, conflict, and synthesis that continue to generate important philosophical and political insights. His influence extends far beyond academic philosophy into social theory, political science, literary criticism, and cultural analysis. While his specific metaphysical system convinces few contemporary philosophers, his insights about the historical character of reason, the productive nature of contradiction, and the social constitution of consciousness remain philosophically vital. Hegel showed that philosophy must grapple with time, development, and systematic relationships rather than seeking eternal truths in isolation from historical context. His transformation of philosophy into a fundamentally historical discipline makes him one of the most revolutionary thinkers in human history. Baruch Spinoza, the lens grinder who saw God in everything. Baruch Spinoza lived one of the most quietly revolutionary lives in intellectual history. Excommunicated from Amsterdam's Jewish community at age 23 for his heretical ideas, this brilliant Dutch philosopher spent his remaining years grinding lenses for microscopes and telescopes while constructing a philosophical system so radical that it would fundamentally transform how humanity thinks about God, nature, freedom, and the human condition. Spinoza didn't just challenge religious orthodoxy, he rebuilt philosophy from the ground up using the rigorous methods of geometry. Born in 1632 to Portuguese Jewish refugees who had fled the Inquisition, Spinoza was raised in Amsterdam's vibrant Sephardic community, but his philosophical inquiries led him to conclusions that horrified religious authorities. In 1656, the synagogue pronounced the most severe form of excommunication against him. "Cursed be he by day, and cursed be he by night. Cursed be he when he lies down, and cursed be he when he rises up." Spinoza's crime: questioning the anthropomorphic conception of God and the literal truth of Scripture. Undeterred by social ostracism, Spinoza developed a philosophical system of breathtaking scope and logical rigor. His masterwork, The Ethics, is written in geometric form: definitions, axioms, propositions, and proofs, as if moral and metaphysical truths could be demonstrated with the same certainty as mathematical theorems. This wasn't mere stylistic affectation, but reflected Spinoza's conviction that reality itself follows rational principles that human reason can grasp. Spinoza's central insight was that God and nature are identical. Deus sive natura, God or nature. This wasn't atheism, but a radical reconception of divinity. Instead of an anthropomorphic deity who created the world from nothing and intervenes in human affairs, Spinoza's God is the eternal, infinite substance that is identical with the totality of existence. Everything that exists is a modification or expression of this single substance. This substance monism had revolutionary implications. If everything is part of one substance, then the traditional distinction between mind and body collapses. Mental and physical events aren't separate substances mysteriously interacting, but two aspects of the same underlying reality, like two sides of a coin. When I decide to raise my arm and my arm rises, these aren't separate mental and physical events, but one event described from two perspectives. Spinoza's determinism was equally radical. Everything that happens follows necessarily from the laws of nature, which are identical with God's eternal decrees. Human beings aren't exempt from natural causation. Our thoughts, emotions, and actions are as determined as the motion of planets or the growth of plants. Free will, in the libertarian sense of uncaused choice, is an illusion born of ignorance about the causes that determine our behavior. But Spinoza didn't see determinism as defeating human freedom. True freedom isn't the ability to escape causal determination, but understanding our place in the causal order and acting from our own nature, rather than external compulsion. The free person is one who acts from adequate ideas rather than confused emotions, who understands the necessity that governs existence rather than raging against it. This led to Spinoza's revolutionary approach to ethics. Traditional morality, based on commands and prohibitions, reflects inadequate understanding of human nature. People aren't inherently good or evil, but express their essential nature as finite modes of infinite substance. What we call vice is really just human nature inadequately expressed, confused, self-destructive, reactive. What we call virtue is human nature adequately expressed, rational, self-affirming, active. Spinoza's political philosophy was equally innovative. In the Theological Political Treatise, he argued that governments exist to promote human flourishing rather than enforce divine commands. Religious authorities have no legitimate political power, and true religion consists in justice and charity rather than theological doctrine. Contemporary philosophers have engaged seriously with Spinoza's insights while questioning his systematic ambitions. His substance monism faces the challenge of explaining genuine diversity. If everything is modifications of one substance, how can we account for the real differences between minds and bodies? Critics argue that Spinoza's system either collapses into pure materialism or remains mysteriously dualistic. Recent scholarship has revealed the sophistication of Spinoza's psychological and political insights. His analysis of how emotions arise from inadequate ideas and can be transformed through understanding anticipates modern cognitive behavioral therapy. Environmental philosophers have found Spinoza's identification of God with nature particularly congenial. Spinoza's influence on subsequent philosophy was enormous despite initial neglect. German idealists like Schelling and Hegel were deeply influenced by his substance monism. Modern philosophers from Nietzsche to contemporary materialists acknowledge debts to Spinozan naturalism. His approach to religious texts influenced Enlightenment criticism of revealed religion. The therapeutic dimension of Spinoza's philosophy continues to attract contemporary readers. His promise that philosophical understanding can transform destructive emotions into empowering insights resonates with modern searches for meaning and psychological health. The Ethics functions simultaneously as metaphysical treatise and guide to human flourishing. Spinoza belongs in level 4 because his philosophical system fundamentally reconceptualized the relationship between God, nature, mind, and ethics in ways that continue to influence contemporary thought. His rigorous naturalism, his insights about the unity of mental and physical phenomena, and his approach to human emotions as natural phenomena subject to rational analysis established frameworks that remain philosophically vital. Level 5. The Profound Innovators. Philosophers who fundamentally changed how we think. Level 5 consists of philosophers who fundamentally transformed how major philosophical problems are approached. Their insights opened up entirely new ways of thinking about knowledge, reality, ethics, or human nature. They're not just participating in existing debates, they're creating new philosophical territories. Immanuel Kant, the philosopher who redrew the map of human knowledge. We've reached the summit now, level 5, where the air gets thin and only the most revolutionary minds can survive. These aren't just philosophers who changed how we think about specific problems. These are the architects of entirely new ways of understanding reality itself. And standing at the entrance to this rarefied realm is Immanuel Kant, the man who literally woke up one morning and decided to stage a Copernican revolution in philosophy. Picture this. It's 1781 in the small Prussian town of Königsberg. A meticulous bachelor professor, so regular in his habits that townspeople set their clocks by his daily walks, publishes a book with the modest title, Critique of Pure Reason. What follows isn't just another philosophical treatise, it's an intellectual earthquake that splits the history of human thought into before Kant and after Kant. Kant had been jolted awake from what he called his dogmatic slumber by David Hume's devastating skeptical arguments. If Hume was right that we can't rationally justify our beliefs about causation, induction, or even the external world, then the entire Enlightenment project of building knowledge on rational foundations would collapse. But rather than accepting Hume's skeptical conclusions or retreating into religious faith, Kant chose a third path that was so audacious it bordered on the insane. What if, Kant asked, we've been thinking about knowledge backwards? Instead of assuming that our minds must conform to objects in order to know them, what if objects must conform to the structure of our minds in order to be experienced at all? This Copernican revolution suggested that space, time, causation, and other fundamental features of reality aren't properties of things in themselves but necessary structures of human cognition. Think about what this means. When you see a red apple on a table, Kant argues that the spatial location, the temporal persistence, and even the causal interactions you observe aren't features of some mind-independent apple. They're contributions your mind makes to organize the raw data of sensation into coherent experience. Space and time aren't containers in which things exist. They're the forms through which your mind necessarily structures all possible experience. This solved Hume's problem about causation at a stunning cost. Yes, we can have synthetic a priori knowledge that's both informative about the world and knowable independently of experience. But this knowledge only applies to phenomena, to things as they appear to us through the structures of human cognition. The things in themselves, the nominal realm behind appearances, remains forever unknowable. Kant's ethical philosophy was equally revolutionary. Most moral theories ground ethics in consequences, divine commands, or human nature. Kant argued that genuine morality must be based on rational duty alone, independent of desires, emotions, or empirical facts about human psychology. The categorical imperative, act only according to that maxim whereby you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law, provides a purely rational test for moral rightness. This means lying is wrong, not because it has bad consequences, but because you can't rationally will that everyone should lie whenever it's convenient. The universalization test reveals the logical contradiction hidden in immoral maxims. Murder, theft, and promise breaking all fail this test because their universal adoption would undermine the very practices they presuppose. But Kant's ethics goes deeper than rule following. The categorical imperative's second formulation demands that we treat humanity, whether in ourselves or others, always as an end and never merely as a means. This dignity of rational beings grounds human rights, democratic governance, and moral equality in ways that consequentialist and virtue-based theories struggle to match. Contemporary philosophers continue to wrestle with Kant's legacy, often defining their positions in relation to his insights. The challenges to his system are formidable. Einstein's relativity theory seems to refute Kant's claim that Euclidean geometry and Newtonian mechanics are necessarily true of all possible experience. Evolutionary psychology suggests that the structures Kant thought were universal features of human reason might be contingent products of natural selection. His moral philosophy faces equally serious objections. Critics argue that the categorical imperative generates conflicting duties, that it's too rigid to handle moral complexity, and that it ignores the importance of emotions, relationships, and consequences in ethical life. Feminist philosophers contend that Kant's emphasis on impartial rationality reflects masculine biases that devalue care, empathy, and contextual judgment. Yet Kant's influence remains inescapable. Even philosophers who reject his specific arguments often work within frameworks he established. The idea that philosophy should examine the conditions of possibility for experience, knowledge, or moral judgment, rather than simply describing reality, has become central to philosophical methodology. His insights about the active role of mind in constituting experience anticipated developments in psychology, cognitive science, and phenomenology. The transcendental method, asking what must be true for certain forms of experience or judgment to be possible, remains a powerful philosophical tool. Philosophers use transcendental arguments to defend everything from moral realism to the existence of other minds to the objectivity of logic. Kant achieves level 5 status because he didn't just solve particular philosophical problems, he redefined what philosophy could and should do. His critical philosophy established new ways of thinking about the relationship between mind and world, reason and experience, freedom and nature that continue to structure philosophical inquiry. Even when contemporary philosophers reject Kantian solutions, they often accept Kantian formulations of problems. The Königsberg professor, who never traveled more than 40 miles from his birthplace, somehow managed to map the entire territory of human thought with unprecedented precision. His revolution in philosophy paralleled and enabled the democratic revolutions in politics, the scientific revolution in natural knowledge, and the moral revolution in human rights. That's why Immanuel Kant stands as one of the supreme architects of the modern mind. Augustine of Hippo, the sinner who invented the self. When Augustine of Hippo sat down around 397 AD to write his Confessions, he had no idea he was about to invent autobiography, revolutionize Christianity, and create the modern concept of the self. This brilliant, tormented North African bishop didn't just chronicle his journey from dissolute youth to Christian saint. He excavated the deepest structures of human consciousness with a psychological penetration that wouldn't be matched for over a millennium. Picture the setting. The Roman Empire is crumbling, barbarian tribes are at the gates, and the old certainties of classical civilization are dissolving into chaos. Into this world of upheaval steps Augustine, a man whose personal transformation mirrors and shapes the transformation of an entire civilization. His story isn't just one man's spiritual journey, it's the birth narrative of the Western soul. Augustine's early life reads like a case study in brilliant self-destruction. Born to a pagan father and Christian mother in North Africa, he spent his youth chasing every pleasure and intellectual fashion available in the late Roman world. He kept a mistress for 15 years, fathered a child, joined the heretical Manichaean sect, and threw himself into the pursuit of rhetorical success with an intensity that would make modern careerists blush. But Augustine's genius lay in his ability to anatomize his own corruption with unprecedented psychological insight. When he describes stealing pears as a child, not from hunger or need, but purely for the joy of doing evil, he's not just confessing a minor sin, he's identifying the fundamental perversity of the human will, its tendency to choose evil precisely because it is evil. I loved my own error, he writes, not that for which I erred, but the error itself. This analysis of the divided will became Augustine's greatest contribution to understanding human nature. Unlike classical philosophers who saw wrongdoing as ignorance, if you truly knew what was good, you would do it. Augustine recognized that humans can know the good and still choose evil. The will is not simply ignorant, it is fundamentally corrupted, turned in on itself in what he called concupiscence, the self-centered desire that distorts all human motivation. The psychological breakthrough came in Augustine's famous garden scene. Torn between his desire for Christian conversion and his attachment to worldly pleasures, Augustine heard a child's voice saying, "Take up and read." Opening Paul's letter to the Romans, he encountered words that spoke directly to his condition. The conversion wasn't just an intellectual assent to Christian doctrine, it was a fundamental reorientation of the will through divine grace. This experience led Augustine to revolutionary insights about time, memory, and consciousness that anticipate modern psychology and phenomenology. In Book 11 of the Confessions, he asks, "What then is time? If no one asks me, I know. If I want to explain it to a questioner, I do not know." His analysis reveals that past exists only in memory, future only in expectation, and the present is a knife edge between them. Human consciousness exists in this strange temporal flow, constantly reconstructing its identity through narrative memory. Augustine's theology was equally revolutionary. Against the Pelagians, who believed humans could achieve salvation through their own moral efforts, Augustine argued that the fall had so corrupted human nature that salvation required divine grace. We can't save ourselves because the very will that would have to choose salvation is itself fallen. This doctrine of original sin became foundational to Western Christianity and profoundly shaped ideas about human nature, politics, and society. His political philosophy in The City of God created the framework for medieval Christendom. Written in response to the sack of Rome in 410, Augustine argued that earthly kingdoms are always imperfect shadows of the heavenly city. Political authority exists to restrain sin and maintain order, but it can never create true justice or human flourishing. Contemporary philosophers continue to grapple with Augustine's insights about the self, time, and human motivation. His analysis of the will influenced thinkers from Aquinas to Luther to Kierkegaard. His psychological penetration anticipated Freud's discoveries about unconscious motivation and the divided self. His phenomenology of time consciousness prefigured Husserl and Heidegger's analyses of temporal experience. Critics have challenged Augustine's pessimistic view of human nature and his emphasis on divine grace at the expense of human freedom. His theology of original sin has been criticized as promoting unhealthy guilt and self-hatred. Yet Augustine's influence on Western thought extends far beyond theology. His introspective method became central to modern philosophy from Descartes through phenomenology. His literary achievement cannot be separated from his philosophical innovations. The Confessions created a new form of writing that combined philosophical analysis with personal narrative, theological reflection with psychological penetration. This integration of thought and life, reason and experience became a model for later thinkers seeking to understand the human condition. Augustine achieves level 5 status because he didn't just develop new philosophical theories, he discovered new regions of human experience and created new ways of exploring them. His introspective method opened up the interiority of consciousness as a legitimate domain of philosophical investigation. His analysis of the will, time, and memory provided conceptual tools that remain indispensable for understanding human experience. The man who prayed, "Lord, make me chaste, but not yet," somehow managed to capture the fundamental contradictions of human existence with unmatched honesty and insight. Augustine showed that philosophical understanding requires not just logical analysis, but personal transformation, creating a new form of inquiry that fuses intellectual rigor with spiritual depth. Plotinus, the mystic who made philosophy divine. At level 5, we encounter minds so profound they don't just think differently, they think about thinking itself in ways that reshape reality. Plotinus stands here not as a mere philosopher, but as the architect of an entire cosmos, a visionary who took the abstract speculations of Plato and transformed them into a living, breathing, spiritual universe that would captivate minds for nearly 2 millennia. Born around 204 AD in Roman Egypt, Plotinus lived during an age of crisis when the classical world was fragmenting and new spiritual movements were emerging from every corner of the empire. Christianity was spreading, mystery religions flourished, and philosophical schools competed for souls as much as minds. Into this chaos stepped a man who would synthesize the entire Greek philosophical tradition into a system of such beauty and power that it became the last great flowering of ancient philosophy. But calling Plotinus merely the last great ancient philosopher misses the revolutionary nature of his achievement. He didn't just systematize Plato, he discovered hidden depths in Platonic thought that Plato himself might not have recognized. Where Plato had spoken of forms as the highest reality, Plotinus saw them as merely the second level of a cosmic hierarchy that ascended to something beyond being itself. The centerpiece of Plotinus's system is his doctrine of the One, the absolute source from which all reality emanates. The One isn't a being among other beings, not even the highest being. It transcends being, thought, and language entirely. We can't even properly say the One exists because existence implies limitation, and the One is beyond all limits. It's pure unity, pure actuality, the source from which everything flows, but which itself remains perfectly simple and unchanging. From this incomprehensible source, reality emanates in successive levels like light radiating from the sun. First comes nous, divine intellect, where the Platonic forms exist as thoughts of cosmic intelligence. Then comes soul, which bridges the intellectual realm and material world. Finally, at the furthest remove from the One lies matter, not evil in itself, but the absolute limit of the One's power, where being fades into near nothingness. This isn't just abstract metaphysics, it's a roadmap for spiritual ascent. Human beings exist at multiple levels simultaneously. Our bodies participate in the material realm, our rational souls in the realm of soul, and our highest faculty remains eternally connected to nous. The goal of philosophy isn't just intellectual understanding, but actual return to our source through mystical union with the One. Plotinus himself achieved this union multiple times, according to his student Porphyry. These weren't drug-induced visions or emotional ecstasies, but the culmination of rigorous philosophical and spiritual discipline. Through contemplation, purification, and the progressive transcendence of discursive thought, the soul could return to its source and experience the bliss of unity with the Absolute. This mystical dimension makes Plotinus unique among great philosophers. While thinkers like Aristotle or Kant construct magnificent intellectual systems, Plotinus offers something more. A transformation of consciousness itself. His philosophy isn't just about understanding reality, but about becoming reality at its highest level. The philosopher doesn't just think about the One. In moments of ecstasy, the philosopher becomes one with the One. Contemporary philosophers have struggled with Plotinus's legacy. His influence on Christian theology was enormous. Augustine, Pseudo-Dionysius, and countless medieval thinkers drew heavily on Plotinian themes. Renaissance Platonists like Marsilio Ficino revived Plotinian themes, and Romantic philosophers found in him a kindred spirit who saw nature as the self-revelation of absolute spirit. Yet modern philosophy has largely abandoned Plotinian metaphysics as scientifically obsolete and methodologically suspect. Critics argue that Plotinus's system, however beautiful, remains a magnificent fantasy that tells us more about human psychology than cosmic reality. But this criticism misses Plotinus's enduring insights, his analysis of consciousness as irreducibly first-personal, his recognition that self-knowledge involves self-transcendence, and his insight that intellectual activity points beyond itself toward pure unity, anticipate themes in phenomenology and philosophy of mind. Contemporary philosophers like Pierre Hadot have recovered the transformative dimension of ancient philosophy that Plotinus exemplified. His aesthetic theory remains influential. The idea that beauty consists in the soul's recognition of its own nature reflected in sensible objects, that artistic creation involves participation in divine creativity, and that contemplation of beauty can trigger spiritual ascent, continue to influence theories of aesthetic experience. The deeper significance of Plotinus lies in his demonstration that rigorous philosophical thinking can lead to mystical experience without abandoning intellectual honesty. Unlike anti-intellectual mysticisms that reject reason, Plotinus shows how rational inquiry, pursued to its limits, naturally transcends itself. The philosopher becomes mystic not by abandoning thought, but by thinking so deeply that discursive reasoning gives way to intuitive union. Plotinus achieves level 5 status because he created an entire worldview that integrated metaphysics, epistemology, ethics, aesthetics, and spiritual practice into a unified vision of reality. His influence shaped not just philosophy, but theology, literature, art, and spirituality across multiple traditions. Even when later thinkers rejected his specific doctrines, they often retained his methods and insights. The man who claimed to be ashamed of having a body created the most embodied philosophy in the ancient world, one where physical beauty, intellectual truth, and spiritual transcendence form a seamless whole. His vision of philosophy as a way of life that culminates in mystical union established an ideal that continues to inspire seekers who refuse to separate understanding from transformation. Martin Heidegger, the thinker who asked what we forgot to ask. We're deep in level 5 territory now, where philosophers don't just answer questions, they reveal that we've been asking the wrong questions entirely. Martin Heidegger stands as perhaps the most radical figure here, a thinker who claimed that 2,500 years of Western philosophy had fundamentally misunderstood what it means to be. What he offered wasn't just another philosophical system, but a complete reorientation of thinking itself, a return to the most basic question that philosophy had somehow forgotten to ask. Picture a young German professor in the 1920s, steeped in the phenomenological tradition of his teacher Edmund Husserl, but growing increasingly convinced that even phenomenology hadn't penetrated to the deepest level of philosophical questioning. While other philosophers debated the nature of knowledge, consciousness, or reality, Heidegger stepped back and asked a more fundamental question. What does it mean for anything to be at all? This wasn't just academic curiosity. Heidegger believed that Western civilization was in crisis precisely because we had forgotten this most basic question. We had become so absorbed in manipulating and calculating beings that we had lost sight of being itself, the condition that makes it possible for anything to show up as meaningful at all. Heidegger's masterwork, Being and Time, published in 1927, launched what he called the destruction of traditional ontology. But this wasn't nihilistic demolition. It was an attempt to clear away centuries of philosophical debris to recover the original wonder that first sparked philosophical thinking in ancient Greece. The Greeks, Heidegger argued, had a direct experience of being that we had lost through the development of metaphysics, science, and technology. Central to Heidegger's analysis is his concept of Dasein, literally being there, his term for human existence. Unlike traditional philosophy that treated humans as conscious subjects contemplating external objects, Heidegger argued that our most basic mode of being is not detached observation, but engaged involvement in a meaningful world. We don't first exist and then encounter a world. We are always already thrown into situations that matter to us. This thrownness, Geworfenheit, reveals the fundamentally finite and historical character of human existence. We don't choose our starting point. We find ourselves in specific historical circumstances with inherited possibilities and limitations. Yet this thrownness isn't pure determination, because we also project, entwerfen ourselves toward future possibilities. Human existence is essentially temporal, stretched between a past we didn't choose and a future we must create. Heidegger's analysis of temporality revolutionized how we think about time. Instead of treating time as a series of now points flowing from past through present to future, Heidegger showed that authentic temporality is structured by our projects and concerns. The future isn't not yet now, but the dimension from which our present activities draw their meaning. This led to Heidegger's devastating critique of modern technology and scientific thinking. What he called enframing, Gestel, the tendency to treat everything, including human beings, as resources to be optimized and controlled, represents the culmination of Western metaphysics' forgetfulness of being. We've become so skilled at manipulating beings that we've lost the capacity to let beings be. The political implications of Heidegger's philosophy became tragically clear in the 1930s when he joined the Nazi Party and served as rector at the University of Freiburg. His vision of authentic existence, his critique of modern rationality, and his celebration of rootedness in soil and tradition aligned with Nazi ideology in ways that continue to disturb readers. Heidegger never adequately confronted his political involvement, leading to ongoing debates about the relationship between his philosophy and his politics. Contemporary philosophers have struggled with this legacy while recognizing Heidegger's profound influence. Existentialists like Sartre and Merleau-Ponty built on Heidegger's analysis of existence while rejecting his political conclusions. Postmodern thinkers like Derrida and Foucault adopted his critique of Western metaphysics while developing it in different directions. Critics argue that Heidegger's thinking remains trapped in romantic nostalgia for a pre-modern world that never existed. His critique of technology often seems to ignore its genuine benefits for human flourishing. His emphasis on authenticity and rootedness can slide into dangerous forms of nationalism and exclusion. Yet Heidegger's insights about the primacy of practical engagement over theoretical detachment have proven enormously influential. Cognitive scientists studying embodied cognition, philosophers of mind exploring the extended mind thesis, and artificial intelligence researchers grappling with the frame problem all wrestle with Heideggerian themes. Environmental philosophers have found resources in Heidegger's critique of instrumental rationality and his call for dwelling that lets beings be. His later thinking about language as the house of being influenced literary theory and philosophical hermeneutics. Even his political errors have proven philosophically productive by forcing serious engagement with the relationship between thought and historical responsibility. The deeper significance of Heidegger lies in his transformation of philosophy's fundamental orientation. Instead of seeking eternal truths or foundational principles, he showed how philosophical thinking could become a form of historical self-understanding that remains open to the mystery of being. Philosophy becomes less about solving problems and more about dwelling thoughtfully with fundamental questions. Heidegger achieves level 5 status because he didn't just develop new philosophical theories, he transformed what philosophy could be. His question of being opened dimensions of inquiry that continue to generate important work across multiple disciplines. His analysis of existence as temporally structured, practically engaged, and historically situated established frameworks that remain philosophically vital even when specific doctrines are rejected.
Level 6. The Foundational Giants. Philosophers who established entire traditions of thought. Level 6 consists of philosophers who didn't just contribute to existing philosophical conversations, but established entire traditions of thought that influenced centuries of subsequent thinking. Their work provides the intellectual foundations that later philosophers build upon, critique, or react against.
Thomas Hobbes, the philosopher who invented the modern state. Welcome to Level 6, the summit of human thought where we encounter the architects of the modern world itself. These aren't just influential philosophers, they're the intellectual engineers who built the conceptual foundations upon which our entire civilization rests. And standing first among these titans is Thomas Hobbes, the man who looked into the abyss of human nature and pulled from it the blueprint for political authority that still governs us today. Picture England in the 1640s. Civil war rages, the king has been executed, and society is tearing itself apart in religious and political fury. Traditional sources of authority, divine right, ancient custom, noble blood, lie shattered. Into this chaos steps Hobbes with a radical proposition. Political authority doesn't come from God or tradition, but from a rational calculation about human survival. Government exists not because it's natural or divinely ordained, but because without it, life would be solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Hobbes's starting point was ruthlessly materialistic. Humans are complex machines, driven by appetites and aversions, seeking pleasure and avoiding pain. Unlike medieval thinkers, who saw humans as naturally social beings oriented toward the common good, Hobbes argued that we are fundamentally self-interested creatures who cooperate only when it serves our purposes. This leads to Hobbes's most famous thought experiment, the state of nature. Imagine humans without government, law, or social institutions. What would life be like? Hobbes's answer was terrifying. Without a common power to keep everyone in awe, there would be a war of all against all. Not necessarily constant fighting, but a condition where violence could erupt at any moment because nothing prevents it. In such a world, there could be no industry, agriculture, navigation, art, or knowledge, because who would invest effort in anything that others could simply take by force? The only escape from this nightmare is the social contract, arguably the most influential political concept ever conceived. Rational individuals would agree to surrender their natural right to everything to a sovereign power in exchange for protection and the possibility of civilized life. This isn't a historical claim about how governments actually formed, but a logical argument about why government is necessary and when it's legitimate. Hobbes's sovereign must be absolute. Half measures won't work because any limitation on sovereign power creates the possibility of conflict about who has ultimate authority, which returns us to the state of nature. The sovereign must have final say over law, religion, property, and war. This isn't tyranny, but necessity. The alternative isn't freedom, but chaos. This argument revolutionized political thought by making it secular and scientific. Political authority doesn't flow from God's will or natural hierarchy, but from human reason calculating the conditions necessary for survival and prosperity. Hobbes invented political science by treating government as a human artifact designed to solve specific problems rather than a natural institution or divine mystery. The implications cascade through every aspect of modern life. Hobbes established the framework for thinking about state monopoly on legitimate violence, the relationship between individual rights and collective security, and the trade-offs between freedom and order that define political life. His insights about how fear motivates cooperation remain central to political science, international relations, and constitutional theory. Contemporary critics have challenged Hobbes's pessimistic view of human nature. Anthropological evidence suggests that humans are more naturally cooperative than Hobbes assumed. His state of nature appears to be a philosophical fiction rather than a description of pre-political life. The absolutist implications trouble liberals who worry about constraints on government power. Yet Hobbes's influence on subsequent political thought has been enormous. Locke, Rousseau, and virtually every major political theorist since has defined their position partly in response to Hobbesian insights. Contemporary debates about national security versus civil liberties and the sources of political legitimacy all operate within frameworks Hobbes established. His psychological insights about fear, competition, and cooperation anticipated developments in evolutionary psychology, game theory, and behavioral economics. His materialistic approach to human nature contributed to the development of scientific psychology. The deeper significance of Hobbes lies in his transformation of political philosophy from medieval speculation about divine order into modern analysis of human institutions. He showed how rational inquiry could address fundamental questions about authority, obligation, and justice without appealing to religious or metaphysical foundations. Hobbes achieves level 6 status because he didn't just influence political philosophy, he created the conceptual vocabulary within which modern political life operates. His analysis of sovereignty, authority, and legitimacy established frameworks that structure contemporary debates about everything from constitutional law to international relations. Even thinkers who reject his conclusions often accept his formulation of fundamental political problems. The man who famously declared that covenants without the sword are but words understood that political theory must grapple with the harsh realities of power and human nature. His vision of government as a rational response to the problems of collective action rather than a natural or divine institution remains the foundation of modern political science. Hobbes taught us that civilization is not natural but artificial, a precious human achievement that requires constant maintenance and rational design. John Locke, the philosopher who invented your rights. Here in Level 6, we encounter the mind that didn't just theorize about human freedom. He created the intellectual architecture that makes your daily liberty possible. John Locke stands as perhaps the most practically influential philosopher who ever lived, because every time you speak freely, practice your religion, own property, or vote in an election, you're living inside a world that Locke's ideas made possible. He didn't just write about rights, he invented the very concept of individual rights as we understand them today. The England that shaped Locke was a nation convulsed by religious warfare and political upheaval. Born in 1632, Locke witnessed the English Civil War, the execution of Charles I, Cromwell's Puritan dictatorship, the restoration of the monarchy, and finally, the Glorious Revolution of 1688. These weren't abstract political events, but existential questions. Who has the right to rule? What are the limits of government power? Can people resist tyrannical authority? Locke's genius was to answer these questions by fundamentally reimagining the relationship between individuals and government. Where Hobbes had argued that people must surrender their rights to an absolute sovereign to escape the chaos of the state of nature, Locke proposed something revolutionary. People retain their natural rights even after forming governments, and governments exist solely to protect those rights. This insight began with Locke's radically different conception of the state of nature. Unlike Hobbes's war of all against all, Locke's state of nature is relatively peaceful. People are naturally free and equal, endowed by their creator, with certain inalienable rights to life, liberty, and property. The problem isn't that people are constantly at each other's throats, but that there's no impartial judge to settle disputes and no reliable way to enforce agreements. Locke's theory of property was particularly revolutionary. In the state of nature, the earth belongs to all humanity in common. But when individuals mix their labor with natural resources, when they clear land, plant crops, or craft tools, they acquire exclusive property rights in what they create. This labor theory of value established that individuals have rights that exist independently of government recognition. This led to Locke's most explosive political conclusion. Governments derive their authority from the consent of the governed, and when governments violate the rights they were created to protect, people have the right to revolution. Locke wrote his 2 treatises of government to justify the overthrow of James II, but his arguments provided the intellectual foundation for the American Revolution, the French Revolution, and virtually every subsequent struggle for democratic government. The practical implications were staggering. If government authority comes from popular consent rather than divine right, then constitutions can limit government power. If individuals have natural rights that governments must respect, then bills of rights become necessary. If people can withdraw their consent from unjust governments, then revolution becomes not just permissible, but sometimes obligatory. Locke's Letter Concerning Toleration extended these insights to religious freedom. Since salvation depends on sincere belief, which cannot be coerced, governments have no business enforcing religious conformity. This separation of church and state protected the integrity of faith by removing it from political manipulation. His essay concerning human understanding revolutionized philosophy by arguing that all knowledge comes from experience rather than innate ideas. The mind is a blank slate written upon by sensation and reflection. This empirical approach supported his political conclusions. If there are no innate ideas about social hierarchy, then all such arrangements must be justified by their consequences. Contemporary critics have identified significant problems in Locke's framework. His labor theory of property seems to justify unlimited accumulation that leaves others worse off. His social contract theory struggles to explain political obligation for those who never explicitly consented. Feminist scholars note that Locke's theory largely ignores women's political status. Post-colonial critics point out that his defense of property rights helped justify European colonization of indigenous lands. Yet Locke's influence on the modern world has been unprecedented. The American Declaration of Independence paraphrases Locke's language about life, liberty, and property. The US Constitution embodies Lockean principles about limited government, separation of powers, and protection of individual rights. His insights about religious toleration influenced the development of secular government and pluralistic society. The deeper significance of Locke lies in his demonstration that political authority must be rationally justified rather than simply accepted. He showed how individual freedom and political order could be reconciled through constitutional government based on popular consent. His vision of government as trustee rather than master established frameworks that continue to structure democratic politics. Locke achieves level 6 status because he didn't just contribute to political philosophy, he created the conceptual foundation of liberal democracy itself. His ideas about natural rights, government by consent, religious toleration, and constitutional limits on power established the intellectual framework within which modern democratic societies operate. The man who argued that government has no other end but the preservation of property, meaning life, liberty, and estate, provided the theoretical justification for limiting government power that makes individual freedom possible. Every time you criticize your government without fear of imprisonment, practice your religion freely, or participate in democratic elections, you're benefiting from institutional arrangements that Locke's ideas made intellectually respectable. Locke transformed political philosophy by making individual rights, rather than collective authority, the starting point of political analysis. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the philosopher who discovered human inequality. We're nearing the apex of level 6 now, where we encounter minds that didn't just influence history, they redirected its entire course. Jean-Jacques Rousseau stands here as perhaps the most paradoxical genius in the pantheon, a man who simultaneously inspired the French Revolution's democratic ideals and its totalitarian excesses, who championed individual freedom while advocating collective authority, who diagnosed the diseases of civilization with such penetrating insight that his prescriptions still divide us today. Born in Geneva in 1712, Rousseau was an outsider from birth, a watchmaker's son in an age of aristocratic privilege, a Protestant in Catholic France, a self-taught autodidact among university-educated intellectuals. This outsider status gave him a perspective that his more conventional contemporaries lacked. He could see civilization's contradictions precisely because he never fully belonged to it. Rousseau's revolutionary insight came in a flash of inspiration while walking to visit the imprisoned philosopher Diderot. Reading an essay contest on whether the arts and sciences had improved human morality, Rousseau experienced what he called an illumination that revealed to him civilization's fundamental corruption. While his Enlightenment contemporaries celebrated human progress, Rousseau saw only decline and degradation. His answer to that essay contest launched the idea that would define his life's work: man is born free, and everywhere he is in chains. But these weren't political chains, they were the psychological and social fetters that civilization itself had forged. In the state of nature, Rousseau argued, humans were naturally good, living in harmony with themselves and their environment. It was society that corrupted this natural goodness, creating inequality, competition, and moral degradation. This wasn't nostalgia for some golden age, but a devastating critique of his contemporary world. Rousseau's discourse on inequality traced how private property, social comparison, and artificial needs had transformed naturally equal beings into a hierarchy of masters and slaves. The very institutions that Locke had celebrated as protecting natural rights, property, government, law, Rousseau revealed as mechanisms for perpetuating unjust inequality. But Rousseau wasn't advocating a return to the forest. His genius lay in recognizing that while we can't go back to nature, we might be able to go forward to something better. In the social contract, he proposed a form of government that could reconcile individual freedom with collective authority, the general will. When properly constituted, a political community could express the collective good of all its members, making obedience to law actually a form of freedom because citizens would be obeying only themselves. This concept of the general will was as revolutionary as it was dangerous. It suggested that true democracy involved not just majority rule, but the discovery of what the community as a whole really wanted, which might be different from what most individuals thought they wanted. A properly functioning republic would educate citizens to recognize their real interests as members of a moral community rather than isolated individuals pursuing private gain. Rousseau's educational philosophy in Emile showed how this transformation might be possible. Instead of forcing children to memorize abstract knowledge, education should protect their natural goodness while gradually introducing them to social realities. The goal wasn't to fill empty vessels with information, but to preserve and develop the innate capacity for moral feeling that civilization typically destroys. The political implications were explosive. Rousseau's ideas about popular sovereignty, the general will, and civic education inspired the French Revolution's most radical phases. Robespierre explicitly invoked Rousseauian principles to justify the terror, arguing that forcing people to be free was necessary to create genuine democracy. The same ideas that inspired the Declaration of the Rights of Man also justified the guillotine. Contemporary critics have identified the dangerous potential in Rousseau's thinking. His concept of the general will can justify totalitarian manipulation. If the people don't understand their real interests, then enlightened leaders must force them to be free. His nostalgia for natural goodness can lead to romantic primitivism that ignores the genuine benefits of civilization. His emphasis on collective identity can suppress individual differences and minority rights. Yet Rousseau's influence on modern thought extends far beyond politics. His insight that human nature is fundamentally social and that individual psychology is shaped by social conditions anticipated sociology, anthropology, and developmental psychology. His recognition that civilization creates new forms of suffering even as it solves old problems remains central to critical social theory. His analysis of how social comparison breeds unhappiness prefigured contemporary research on status anxiety and relative deprivation. His understanding of how artificial needs are created and manipulated anticipated critiques of consumer culture. His insights about the psychological effects of inequality informed later work on social justice and human development. Romantic literature, progressive education, environmental movements, and democratic socialism all bear traces of Rousseauian influence. Even thinkers who reject his conclusions often accept his formulation of problems. How can individual freedom be reconciled with social authority? What are the psychological costs of civilization? How can education develop human potential rather than merely serving economic needs? The deeper significance of Rousseau lies in his transformation of how we think about human nature and social progress. He showed that what we take to be natural, inequality, competition, selfishness, might actually be artificial products of particular social arrangements. He revealed that progress isn't simply linear, but involves genuine losses as well as gains. Rousseau's democratic theory influenced the development of participatory democracy, civic republicanism, and theories of deliberative democracy. His educational philosophy shaped progressive education and child-centered pedagogy. His cultural criticism provided intellectual foundations for critiques of mass society and consumer capitalism. Rousseau achieves level 6 status because he identified fundamental tensions in modern life that we're still struggling to resolve. His analysis of how civilization creates the very problems it claims to solve, his insights about the relationship between individual psychology and social structure, and his vision of democracy as moral education rather than mere preference aggregation established frameworks that continue to structure political and social thought. The man who signed his books, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, citizen of Geneva, died believing himself persecuted and misunderstood. But his ideas about natural goodness, social corruption, and democratic possibility unleashed forces that transformed the modern world. Whether those transformations represent progress or regress remains, like Rousseau himself, a matter of ongoing debate. Adam Smith, the Scottish professor who built modern civilization. Here stands the final titan of Level 6, a man whose ideas didn't just influence the modern world, they created it. Adam Smith was a remarkable figure, a soft-spoken Scottish academic who commanded respect across Europe, methodical enough to revise his works obsessively throughout his life, yet possessed of insights so profound they fundamentally altered how humans organize society. When Smith walked the cobblestone streets of 18th century Glasgow, he was unknowingly designing the economic DNA of the future. Born in 1723 in the Scottish fishing town of Kirkcaldy, Smith entered a world still organized around medieval assumptions about wealth and trade. Nations measured their riches in hoarded gold and silver. Governments micromanaged commerce through elaborate systems of tariffs and subsidies. The idea that ordinary people pursuing their daily bread could somehow coordinate to create prosperity for all would have seemed absurd. Smith shattered these assumptions with two works that together constitute perhaps the most influential body of social thought ever produced. But here's what makes Smith unique among the Level 6 philosophers. Smith himself believed the theory of moral sentiments to be his superior work, not the wealth of nations that made him famous. This tells us something crucial. Smith wasn't primarily an economist, but a moral philosopher trying to understand how humans could live together successfully. The theory of moral sentiments, published in 1759, laid the psychological foundation on which the wealth of nations was later to be built. Smith's insight was revolutionary. We develop moral judgment not through abstract reasoning, but through what he called sympathy, our ability to imaginatively enter into others' experiences. As we have no immediate experience of what other men feel, we can form no idea of the manner in which they are affected but by conceiving what we ourselves should feel in the like situation. This might sound like academic psychology, but it was actually the foundation of Smith's entire social vision. Smith argued that economic behavior does not exist within a vacuum and is heavily influenced by social and moral norms. Markets work not because people are selfish, but because they're social beings capable of moral judgment. The butcher and baker serve us well, not from pure greed, but because they've internalized standards of fair dealing through social interaction. When Smith turned to economics in The Wealth of Nations, he wasn't abandoning moral philosophy but extending it. His famous example of the pin factory wasn't just about efficiency, it was about human cooperation. One worker who did all the operations necessary to make a single pin could produce no more than 20 in one day. 10 workers could make 200 pins this way. If, however, the 10 workers each specialized in one or two of the pin-making operations, they would work more efficiently. But Smith's real breakthrough was recognizing what this meant for society as a whole. It is the great multiplication of the productions of all the different arts, in consequence of the division of labor, which occasions, in a well-governed society, that universal opulence which extends itself to the lowest ranks of the people. The pin factory was a microcosm of something much larger, a way of organizing human activity that could make everyone better off. This led to Smith's most famous and misunderstood insight, the invisible hand. Smith used the phrase only once in each of his major works, yet it became the symbol of free market capitalism. Every individual neither intends to promote the public interest nor knows how much he is promoting it. He intends only his own security, and by directing that industry in such a manner as its produce may be of the greatest value. He intends only his own gain, and he is in this, as in many other cases, led by an invisible hand to promote an end which was no part of his intention. What Smith discovered was spontaneous order, the idea that complex beneficial arrangements could emerge without anyone planning them. The price system, he showed, coordinates millions of individual decisions more effectively than any central planner ever could. When bread becomes scarce, rising prices signal bakers to produce more and consumers to use less, all without government direction. But Smith was no libertarian ideologue. He consistently said that the main thing to watch out for are laws that favor masters over their workers, not the other way around. He never opposed the English Poor Law, and he advocated for some policies, a system of public education especially, that would have vastly expanded what the government did on behalf of the poor. Smith understood that markets need moral and institutional foundations to function properly. People of the same trade seldom meet together, even for merriment and diversion, but the conversation ends in a conspiracy against the public or in some contrivance to raise prices. He saw that businessmen would try to rig the system if they could, and that competition needed protection. The man who wrote about the invisible hand also wrote this: "This disposition to admire and almost to worship the rich and the powerful, and to despise, or at least to neglect persons of poor and mean condition, is at the same time the great and most universal cause of the corruption of our moral sentiments." Smith wasn't celebrating inequality, but analyzing how it affects human psychology and social relations. Smith's influence extends far beyond economics. He is sometimes credited with being one of the progenitors of modern sociology, and his lectures on rhetoric have also been called the blueprint for the invention of the modern discipline of English. His method of using systematic observation to understand social phenomena helped create the modern social sciences. The deeper significance of Smith lies in his demonstration that individual freedom and social cooperation aren't opposites, but can reinforce each other when properly structured. He showed how institutions could channel self-interest towards socially beneficial ends without requiring people to be saints. This insight made possible the complex, prosperous societies we live in today. Smith achieves level 6 status because he didn't just theorize about human nature. He discovered how to organize society to work with human nature rather than against it. His synthesis of moral philosophy and economic analysis provided the intellectual foundation for modern democratic capitalism, though Smith himself would likely recoil at the extreme inequality and corporate power that characterizes today's economy. His vision was of competitive markets serving broad prosperity, not wealth concentration among the few, quite contrary to how many modern capitalists invoke Smith's name to justify the very economic arrangements he warned against. Level 7. The Supreme Architects of Thought, a.k.a. the GOATs. The philosophers who fundamentally shaped how humans understand reality. We've reached the peak. Level 7. The absolute pinnacle of human intellectual achievement. Here stand just three figures. Three men from ancient Athens who didn't just change philosophy, they invented it. They created the very categories of human thought that we still use 2,400 years later. This isn't just influence. This is the foundational architecture of the Western mind itself. Coming in at number 3 on our ultimate GOAT list. Aristotle, the mind that mapped reality. Here stands perhaps the most systematic intellect in human history, a man who looked at the entirety of existence and decided to catalogue, analyse, and explain every single piece of it. Aristotle wasn't just a philosopher, he was the philosopher, the one who took the scattered insights of his predecessors and forged them into the comprehensive science of reality itself. Born in 384 BCE in the Macedonian town of Stagira, Aristotle arrived in Athens as a 17-year-old student and would spend the next 20 years in Plato's academy. But where his teacher sought truth in an eternal realm of perfect forms, Aristotle turned his gaze to the messy, complicated, endlessly fascinating world right in front of us. His revolutionary insight was that we don't need to escape this world to understand it. We need to study it more carefully. The scope of Aristotle's achievement is almost incomprehensible. He created logic as a formal discipline, establishing the rules of valid reasoning that wouldn't be improved upon for over 2,000 years. His syllogistic system, all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal, became the foundation of rational argument. He identified the basic logical fallacies that still trap unwary reasoners today and established the principles of valid inference that computers would later use. He founded biology as a systematic science, personally dissecting hundreds of species and developing classification systems that Darwin would later build upon. Aristotle discovered that dolphins are mammals, not fish, an insight that wouldn't be confirmed again until the Renaissance. He described the development of chick embryos day by day, observed the mating habits of bees, and catalogued the anatomy of over 500 animal species. His biological works contain insights so accurate that some weren't verified until the invention of the microscope. In politics, he analysed 158 different constitutions, most now lost to history, to understand how societies organise themselves. He identified the three basic forms of government: monarchy, aristocracy, democracy, and their corrupted versions: tyranny, oligarchy, mob rule. His insight that humans are political animals who can only achieve their full potential in organised communities remains foundational to political theory. His Nicomachean Ethics revolutionized moral philosophy by asking not what is good, but what is the good life. His concept of virtue as the mean between extremes, courage between cowardice and recklessness, generosity between stinginess and waste, provided a practical framework for ethical living. He coined the term eudaimonia, often translated as happiness, but really meaning human flourishing or living well, that still guides discussions of the meaning of life. His Poetics established the foundations of literary theory, analysing tragedy's power to evoke catharsis through pity and fear. His definition of tragedy, the imitation of a complete action with beginning, middle, and end, influenced everyone from Shakespeare to Hollywood screenwriters. He identified the dramatic unities, analysed character development, and explained why humans are drawn to stories about suffering and redemption. In physics, he grappled with motion, change, and causation. While later scientists would reject his specific theories, his method of careful observation and logical analysis established the template for scientific inquiry. He identified the four causes: material, formal, efficient, and final, that still guide philosophical analysis of explanation and causation. His metaphysics tackled the deepest questions about reality itself. What makes something what it is? How do things change while remaining the same? What is the relationship between the universal and particular? His concepts of substance, essence and accident, potentiality and actuality, form and matter became the basic vocabulary for discussing the nature of existence. But Aristotle's greatest contribution was methodological. He showed that knowledge comes not from passive contemplation, but from active investigation. He developed systematic approaches to inquiry, observation, classification, hypothesis formation, and testing that would eventually transform human understanding of the natural world. He created the university as we know it, establishing the ideal of specialized departments working together toward comprehensive knowledge. The medieval world called him simply the philosopher. No other name was necessary. For over a millennium, educated Europeans began their studies by learning Aristotelian logic, ethics, and natural philosophy. Islamic scholars like Averroes and Avicenna preserved and expanded his works when Christian Europe had forgotten them. Jewish thinkers like Maimonides integrated his insights with religious thought. Thomas Aquinas spent his career synthesizing Aristotelian philosophy with Christian theology, creating the intellectual framework of medieval Christendom. The Renaissance rediscovered him through Islamic sources. The scientific revolution both built upon and rebelled against his insights. Galileo had to overthrow Aristotelian physics to establish modern science, but he used Aristotelian logic to do it. Modern biology still uses his method of careful observation and systematic classification. Contemporary virtue ethicists return to his moral insights. Logicians study his contributions to formal reasoning. The student who forged his own path from his master's teachings, the tutor who taught Alexander the Great, who nearly conquered the known world from Macedonia in the west to the banks of the Hyphasis River in modern-day Punjab, India in the east. How to think systematically about conquest and governance, the mind that mapped reality itself across every domain of human experience. Aristotle stands as the supreme systematizer of human knowledge and rightfully claims his place in level 7, the ultimate tier of philosophical greatness. And now, stepping into the number 2 spot in our ultimate philosophical championship. Socrates, the man who taught us we know nothing. Here comes the original gadfly, the street corner philosopher who turned all of Athens upside down with a simple question. What do you really know? Socrates didn't write a single word, built no system, founded no school, yet he single-handedly invented the very idea of philosophy as we know it. While other thinkers before him pondered the nature of the cosmos, Socrates made the revolutionary decision to turn that cosmic questioning inward onto human life itself. Born around 470 BCE into the golden age of Athenian democracy, Socrates witnessed his city's rise to unprecedented heights and its catastrophic fall. He lived through the construction of the Parthenon, the flowering of Greek drama, the Peloponnesian War, and the collapse of everything Athens held sacred. Into this world of shifting certainties stepped a man who would make uncertainty itself the foundation of wisdom. Socrates' method was deceptively simple and devastatingly effective. He would approach the leading citizens of Athens, politicians, poets, craftsmen, religious leaders, and ask them to define their expertise. What is courage? What is justice? What is beauty? What is piety? These seemed like reasonable questions, and his targets initially responded with confidence. But then Socrates would begin probing, asking for clarifications, pointing out contradictions, following implications to their logical conclusions. What happened next was always the same. The confident expert would find themselves tied in logical knots, forced to admit that they couldn't actually define the very thing they claimed to understand. The politician couldn't explain what justice really meant. The priest couldn't define piety. The general couldn't say what courage actually was. One by one, Socrates exposed the hollowness of their supposed knowledge. But here's what made Socrates revolutionary. He didn't claim to know the answers himself. His famous declaration, "I know that I know nothing," wasn't false modesty. It was the foundation of a new approach to truth. While others pretended to knowledge they didn't possess, Socrates had the courage to acknowledge ignorance as the starting point of genuine inquiry. The Socratic method, relentless questioning, exposure of contradictions, the patient pursuit of definitions, became the engine of philosophical progress. Every time you hear someone say, "But wait, what do you mean by that?" Or, "How do you know that's true?" You're witnessing the Socratic legacy in action. He showed that the unexamined life wasn't worth living because most of what we think we know dissolves under careful scrutiny. His influence on ethics was equally transformative. Socrates believed that no one does wrong willingly, that all evil comes from ignorance of the good. If people truly understood what would make them happy and flourishing, they would inevitably choose it. This insight that virtue is knowledge revolutionized moral thinking and established the connection between wisdom and goodness that would define Western ethics. The man himself was as extraordinary as his method. Contemporary accounts describe him as physically ugly but magnetically charismatic, capable of standing motionless in thought for hours, indifferent to physical comfort, and possessing almost supernatural self-control. He fought bravely in 3 military campaigns, saved lives on the battlefield, and showed remarkable physical endurance. At dinner parties, he could drink everyone under the table while remaining completely sober. His commitment to his principles was absolute. When the Athenian democracy sentenced him to death for corrupting the youth and impiety, Socrates had multiple opportunities to escape. His friends arranged his escape route. His accusers probably would have preferred he disappear quietly, and he could have easily fled Athens for another city. Instead, he chose to remain, arguing that a philosopher who spent his life advocating for justice couldn't break the law when it became inconvenient. His final hours, as recorded in Plato's Phaedo, reveal a man facing death with extraordinary equanimity. He spent his last day discussing the immortality of the soul with his friends, maintaining his characteristic intellectual curiosity even as the poison hemlock took effect. His final words were a reminder to offer a sacrifice to Asclepius, the god of healing, perhaps suggesting that death was itself a kind of healing. The trial and death of Socrates became one of history's most powerful symbols of the conflict between independent thinking and conventional authority. Every subsequent philosopher who challenged orthodoxy, every scientist who questioned received wisdom, every reformer who demanded that society examine its assumptions could point to Socrates as the archetype of principled intellectual courage. His indirect influence through his students was immeasurable. He taught Plato, who taught Aristotle, who taught Alexander the Great. That intellectual lineage alone reshaped civilization, but his influence extended far beyond his direct disciples. The Stoics claimed him as their founder. The Cynics traced their philosophy to his example. Early Christians saw him as a pagan saint who prefigured Christ's message of moral transformation. The Socratic paradoxes, that virtue is knowledge, that no one does wrong willingly, that it's better to suffer injustice than to commit it, continue to provoke philosophical discussion 2,400 years later. His method of patient questioning remains the gold standard for philosophical inquiry. His integration of ethical commitment with intellectual rigor established the ideal of the philosopher as moral exemplar. Modern cognitive psychology has vindicated many Socratic insights. The Socratic method proves remarkably effective at exposing overconfidence and helping people recognize the limits of their knowledge. His insight that moral behavior requires genuine understanding rather than mere rule-following anticipates contemporary research on moral psychology and the development of ethical reasoning. The barefoot philosopher who owned nothing but his questions, who made enemies of the powerful by exposing their ignorance, who chose death rather than abandoning his principles, Socrates stands as the embodiment of philosophical courage and intellectual integrity. He didn't just practice philosophy, he became philosophy incarnate, showing that the pursuit of wisdom requires not just clever arguments, but a transformed way of life. The man who knew nothing except that he knew nothing, who taught an empire to question everything, who died for the right to think freely. Socrates rightfully earns his place in level 7, the ultimate tier of philosophical greatness, standing among the trinity of supreme thinkers who fundamentally shaped how humanity understands itself and the world. Plato, the greatest mind in human history. Ladies and gentlemen, we've climbed the mountain of human genius. We've seen brilliant minds that shaped civilizations. But now we arrive at the summit itself. The man, the myth, the absolute legend, the undisputed heavyweight champion of philosophy. His name is Plato. You're probably wondering how one man from ancient Athens managed to revolutionize human thinking as we know it. Born around 428 BCE as Aristocles in aristocratic Athens, Plato witnessed his world collapse. The greatest democracy in history had executed his teacher Socrates for questioning conventional wisdom. Traditional authorities lay shattered, political chaos consumed Athens, and the intellectual foundations of civilization crumbled. From this devastation, Plato forged a philosophical response that would reshape human thought forever. Plato identified a fundamental puzzle that strikes at the heart of human knowledge. We constantly make judgments that invoke perfect standards, calling actions just or unjust, objects beautiful or ugly, arguments true or false. Yet, these perfect standards don't exist in the physical world. We've never encountered perfect justice in human institutions. Every law contains flaws, every judgment remains fallible. Similarly, mathematical truths concern perfect circles and straight lines, yet no physical object perfectly instantiates these geometric properties. His solution was the theory of forms, the most influential metaphysical theory in Western thought. Beyond our visible world of imperfect, changing objects lies an intelligible realm of eternal, unchanging forms. The form of justice provides the standard by which we evaluate particular actions. The form of circle makes geometric knowledge possible. The form of beauty explains why certain objects move us profoundly. They participate in perfect beauty itself. This theory revolutionized philosophy by proposing a radical solution to the problem of universals that continues to influence philosophical debate today. Plato argued that objective knowledge becomes possible because it concerns not the shifting world of appearances, but eternal forms accessible to reason. Whether this theory actually resolves the fundamental questions it addresses remains contested among philosophers, but its influence on subsequent thought has been immense. Plato made this abstract theory accessible through the allegory of the cave. Prisoners chained underground since childhood face a wall where shadows dance. These shadows, cast by objects behind them, constitute their entire reality. They compete over predicting which shadows will appear, honoring the most skilled shadow watchers. One prisoner breaks free, discovers the fire-casting shadows, then gets dragged outside to see the sun illuminating solid objects. When he returns to share this revelation, the others ridicule him and would kill anyone attempting to free them. This allegory maps the structure of reality and knowledge. Shadows represent the world of appearances and opinions that most people mistake for truth. Physical objects represent our everyday material world. The sun represents the form of the good, the ultimate source of truth that makes all knowledge possible. The prisoner's journey illustrates philosophical education, the painful ascent from ignorance through understanding to genuine knowledge of eternal truths. The political implications were radical. If most people live among shadows and illusions, democracy becomes rule by the ignorant. Plato argued for philosopher kings, rulers who have completed the ascent to truth and can govern according to genuine knowledge rather than popular opinion. This wasn't tyranny, but meritocracy. Just as ships need skilled navigators rather than passenger votes, states need wise rulers rather than majority opinion. Plato grounded this political vision in revolutionary psychological theory. The human soul contains three elements: reason seeking truth, spirit seeking honor, and appetite seeking pleasure. Individual justice occurs when reason rules, spirit serves reason, and appetite submits to rational guidance. Political justice mirrors this structure. Philosopher rulers provide wisdom, guardian warriors provide courage, producers practice moderation. Personal virtue and social institutions are inextricably connected. The influence of these insights cascades through intellectual history. Aristotle spent 20 years in Plato's academy and built his entire system responding to Platonic problems. When Aristotle developed his theory of universals and emphasized empirical observation, he worked within frameworks Plato created. Plato and Aristotle together established the foundations of Western philosophy. Plato through his theory of eternal forms and systematic dialogues, Aristotle through his empirical investigations and logical systematization. Every subsequent philosophical tradition has defined itself in relation to these two towering figures. Augustine integrated Platonic insights into Christian theology, relocating the forms within God's divine mind and creating intellectual frameworks that dominated medieval thought for centuries. Renaissance humanists like Marsilio Ficino founded Platonic academies throughout Europe, seeing in Plato's dialogues the philosophical foundations of human dignity and rational inquiry. Modern philosophy's greatest figures engaged deeply with Platonic themes, even when rejecting his specific doctrines. Kant's critical philosophy grappled with the fundamental Platonic question of how reason can access truth beyond sensory experience, though he ultimately limited knowledge to phenomena. Even British empiricists like Locke and Hume, in arguing that all knowledge derives from sensation, were responding to specifically Platonic claims about reason's capacity for independent insight. Even philosophers rejecting Plato responded to specifically Platonic formulations. Contemporary debates about mathematical objects' existence, the nature of consciousness, and the foundations of ethics all engage questions Plato first made philosophically precise. Alfred North Whitehead, himself a distinguished mathematician and philosopher, captured this overwhelming influence when he observed that the safest general characterization of the European philosophical tradition is that it consists of a series of footnotes to Plato. This wasn't hyperbole, but recognition of a fundamental truth. Plato created the conceptual architecture within which serious philosophical inquiry still operates. What elevates Plato above every other mind in human history isn't that he provided final answers. Philosophy doesn't work that way. His genius lies in identifying the deepest questions any serious philosophy must confront and creating the methods to investigate them rigorously. He discovered that the relationship between appearance and reality, the possibility of objective knowledge, and the connection between individual virtue and political order are not separate problems, but aspects of a single, comprehensive vision of human existence. Every philosopher since has worked within the intellectual space that Plato opened, whether building upon his insights or struggling against them. 2.5 millennia later, we still work through implications of insights first emerging in the academy. Whether accepting or rejecting Platonic conclusions, we think about fundamental questions in ways Plato made possible. The undisputed, eternal heavyweight champion of human thought. All hail the GOAT Plato, the end.